I'm remarrying a new wife. You're no longer needed." Following that, my mother-in-law added, "Useless ones should just get divorced and leave." Uttering such harsh words, my father-in-law joined in, realizing the situation. He yelled, "A wife who can't have kids doesn't belong in our family. Just divorce Ryan and let him marry Agnes." Silently standing there, I was speechless. It was the first time in my life I felt so utterly miserable. But at the same time, a firm resolve solidified within me. The time had come for me to fight back. Seeing my expression, everyone but my sister-in-law froze in shock. They probably thought I'd be hurt and on the verge of tears. Defying their expectations, I smiled broadly and said, "I'm already divorced, you know, and that woman." At my words, my parents-in-law and Ryan gasped in disbelief. Uttering pitiful voices, they trembled as they faced this astonishing truth. My name is Margaret, a 31-year-old part-time housewife. I married Ryan 3 years ago, but we don't have any children yet. At 28, when we got married, I was a full-time employee poised for a promising career path. If I continued working, I wanted to build my career until I was 30 and then, once childbirth and parenting had settled, return to a job-friendly environment. Ryan understood this, and we agreed to start trying for a baby after I turned 30. When the time came, having seen a friend struggle with infertility, I decided to get tested just in case. The result revealed my infertility, leading me to switch to part-time work to focus on treatment. Ryan worked in a real estate company, and his take-home pay was more than enough for the two of us. Since we could save a little every month, Ryan was okay with me switching to part-time work. But that's when my nightmare began. Once he knew about my infertility and my change to part-time, Ryan's attitude completely shifted. He had been kind before, but suddenly he said, "I'm a full-timer, you're part-time, so you should take care of all the household chores. Without my income, we can't even afford infertility treatments, let alone live comfortably. To avoid stressing me out, you need to handle all the housework perfectly." I was good at housework since my days living alone, so it wasn't too painful at first. But Ryan started nitpicking over everything. If the room was even slightly messy, he'd yell, "You're lazy. How can a housewife live in such filth?" And if the dishes weren't washed right after a meal, he'd say, "A woman who procrastinates like this isn't cut out for family life. But work more, earn your keep. There's remote work and stuff, right? You could find something. But remember, all the housework is still your responsibility. You're part-time, I'm full-time." At this time, I was still reeling from the shock of my infertility, thinking it was all my fault. I wanted to create a relaxing environment at home for Ryan, who was tired from work, so I tried to meet his expectations. Looking back, I realized I was just giving in to him, telling myself it was just patience until we have a child. I hoped that once we had a child, Ryan would return to his kinder self. Clinging to this hope, I continued juggling part-time work, housework, and infertility treatments. But the strain took its toll. I fell ill, the treatments weren't going well, and our relationship worsened. Gradually, I couldn't keep up with the housework and became more emotional. "You can't even get pregnant and still act all high and mighty. If you don't want a divorce, listen to me," he said, looking down on me. From then on, even a simple request to put his socks in the laundry basket was met with a shout of, "Shut up." I was just trying to make a point, but his contempt made me feel miserable and unsure of what to do next. He started treating me not as a wife but as a convenient woman or a servant. My spirit withered under this treatment. A year passed in this way without a child, and the gap between us remained. This year since becoming part-time and starting the treatment seemed to fly by. It was the most difficult time of my life. However, recently there's been a change. Ryan suddenly became kind, not just a little but a significant shift. It was as if he was a different person, showing increased concern for me. For instance, when infertility treatments weren't going well and I was feeling down, Ryan asked, "You okay? How about I make dinner tonight? I'll whip up your favorite beef stew." It was a mix of happiness and suspicion. After looking down on me so much, this sudden kindness felt like he had a hidden agenda, making me doubtful. So I casually asked Ryan, "What's up? Anything good happened recently?" He relaxed and said, "Yeah, work's going great. I had us selected for a big project, but I might be away from home more as I need to have more meetings with the team." Up to this point, it was fine. My physical burden lessened, and Ryan's career success meant a secure future. Accepting his kindness without suspicion would mean no trouble. But there was one thing bothering me. Recently, Ryan had been overly curious about my activities. I asked him, "What's up with you lately? You used to be so uninterested in what I was doing." Suddenly, he snapped, "What's wrong with wanting to know about my wife's activities, Margaret? Are you doing something behind my back that you can't tell me?" His reaction seemed odd to me. Maybe he was being nice to cover up something he couldn't tell me. A recently divorced friend had told me about her husband becoming nice just before she discovered his affair. So I started suspecting Ryan's infidelity and began observing his movements. While he kept track of my schedule, I noticed a pattern. Ryan regularly went out for drinks on Tuesdays and played golf on the second Sunday of every month. He'd answer normally about other days, but on those specific days, if I asked where he went, he'd get angry, saying, "Damn it, stop nagging me, you're so annoying." It was suspicious. I grew more convinced Ryan might be cheating and decided to take serious action. A few weeks later, needing a break from this covert battle, I went on a little trip. It was a 20-minute drive from home to a cafe that had recently opened and caught my interest. Despite hearing about long lines, I didn't mind waiting alone, so I went there and waited for my turn. That's when I bumped into my sister-in-law. She's a 29-year-old cheerful and kind daycare worker, 2 years younger than me. She always looked up to me like a real sister, and I adored her like my own sibling. When I greeted her, my sister-in-law was startled and looked me up and down in a way she never did. Confused by her strange behavior, I tilted my head. "What's wrong?" Snapped out of it, my sister-in-law blinked, and after a moment of silence, she brightened up and said, "Margaret, let's have lunch together." So we changed the number of people on the reservation and sat together after waiting for several minutes. During lunch, my sister-in-law told me an unbelievable fact that left me speechless and unable to eat. After lunch, instead of going home as planned, I decided to change my plans. I decided to visit my parents-in-law's house with my sister-in-law. Their house is about a 30-minute drive from our apartment, where I currently live, so I don't usually stop by. My parents-in-law aren't exactly fond of me, so I don't see them often, only during the holidays or for memorial services. This would be a rare visit. It was just a little over 10 minutes from the cafe. My sister-in-law, who lives alone and only occasionally visits home, usually informs my mother-in-law when she's coming. But today we decided to go there without notice. It's the second Sunday of the month. Ryan should be at his usual business golf, but strangely, when we arrived at my parents-in-law's house, his car was there. My sister-in-law unlocked the door, and as we entered, I whispered a small hello. My mother-in-law came out and asked with a puzzled look, "What's Margaret doing here?" Her tone was clearly unpleasant just because I visited. She took this attitude simply because a daughter-in-law dropped by the house. I barely managed to hold back a sigh. Then, from the back of the house, I heard voices. Ryan and a woman appeared. Ryan looked shocked for a moment, but the woman cheerfully said, "Nice to meet you. I'm Agnes, the future wife of Ryan." As I stood there dumbfounded, my sister-in-law, with an angry expression, confronted them. "Hey, what's going on here? Explain this." Ryan sighed deeply, then looking down on me, he said something shocking. "I'm remarrying a new wife. You're no longer needed." Following that, my mother-in-law added, "Useless ones should just get divorced and leave," uttering such harsh words. Oddly, I was the only one who remained calm and rational, in contrast to my trembling sister-in-law who seemed both angry and sad. Meanwhile, Ryan, Agnes, and my mother-in-law looked down on me without any sign of remorse. Then my father-in-law, hearing the commotion, came in and quickly understood the situation. He yelled, "A wife who can't have kids doesn't belong in our family. Just divorce Ryan and let him marry Agnes." "Dad," my sister-in-law shouted, trying to stop him, but I slowly raised my head. It was time for my counterattack. Seeing my expression, everyone but my sister-in-law froze. They probably thought I'd be hurt and on the verge of tears, but defying their expectations, I smiled broadly and said, "I'm already divorced, you know." My parents-in-law and Ryan were astonished. They could only utter a pathetic "ha" in response. I had the urge to reveal Agnes's true identity right then and there, but instead, I sighed and said, "Ryan, do you remember the recent fuss you made about divorcing me? You even filled out the divorce papers. Those papers were signed by you, so I filled in my part, submitted them, and consulted a lawyer. Whether you realize it or not, we're already divorced. We're not a couple anymore." Ryan seemed to recall that incident and lost his previously composed demeanor. His eyes darted around, clearly showing his agitation. A few days ago, Ryan and I had an argument, and in a fit of rage, he signed the divorce papers and threatened me. The argument was over something trivial. I had simply asked him again where he goes every second Sunday. It was time to get to the heart of the matter. Ryan, red-faced, yelled, "You're always asking such things. Do you want to tie me down? I'm not having it." It was his usual angry outburst. I pointed out that it was strange for him to get so worked up just because I asked about his whereabouts on the second Sunday. Still, Ryan kept nagging and stormed out of the house. Later, he came back with the divorce papers, filled his part out hastily, and pushed them at me, saying, "I can divorce you anytime." When I asked if he really intended to divorce, Ryan nodded firmly, so I secretly filled in my part and kept the papers in my bag, ready to submit at any time. They were like a talisman, a magical paper that could end my marriage with Ryan if anything happened. Today, after a shocking conversation with my sister-in-law and reaching my limit, I stopped by the office to submit the papers before visiting my parents-in-law. Ryan, hearing this, said, "That was just a threat. I didn't mean it." But my sister-in-law retorted, "You signed it yourself, saying you could divorce anytime. That clearly shows your intent." Ryan fell silent again. I sarcastically said to Ryan, "So we're practically no longer a couple. Happy now?" He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, my mother-in-law interjected with a smug look. "Oh, is that so? Well, divorcing you was always the plan, so that's fine, isn't it?" My father-in-law seemed to agree with her, nodding his head. From their perspective, my divorce from Ryan was inevitable sooner or later, so they thought, why not now? Their true feelings were evident, suggesting that the divorce was a positive outcome for Ryan anyway. Standing next to Ryan, Agnes was also just smirking annoyingly. Noticing this, Ryan chuckled slightly and said, "Yeah, that's right. Our divorce is the first step towards me being with Agnes." It was a skin-crawling statement. Our younger sister-in-law looked embarrassed by this scene, maybe ashamed of these four. For me, holding back laughter at this foolish family and Agnes was a challenge, ignoring their triumphant looks. I operated my smartphone and showed them a photo. It was clear evidence of Ryan and Agnes's affair, pinpointing the place and time in just one shot. "I didn't file for divorce on a whim," I told Ryan. "I've gathered all the evidence of your affair from the start." Seeing him gulp at my words, I glanced at him as Agnes suddenly burst into laughter. Frowning, I looked at Agnes as she blurted out, "So you've thoroughly investigated me too? That woman you almost mentioned, I guess you figured her out. Were you going to reveal that she's pregnant? Too bad. Ryan and his parents know it and deliberately let me stay here." Hearing this, our sister-in-law was shocked. She had been told by Ryan and their parents that we were divorced when we met at the cafe. The reason for the divorce was particularly shocking. They said I was terminally ill with little time left and that I initiated the breakup. They seemed tearful and surprised by my sudden appearance at the cafe. My sister-in-law thought she was hallucinating, hence her strange behavior, which she apologized for. Hearing their story, I was appalled. Ryan had lied about separating from his wife due to a made-up illness. He told his sister, "Margaret is now despairing in life, so please don't contact her and accidentally upset her." Believing this, my sister-in-law refrained from reaching out to me. However, upon returning home, she was surprised to find a strange woman living there whom my parents-in-law introduced as Ryan's new wife. Until now, my sister-in-law realized she had been deceived, but she was hearing for the first time about Agnes's pregnancy. In response to Agnes's smug attitude, I burst out laughing. After my laughter subsided, I spoke to a stunned Agnes. "Of course, I knew you were pregnant. My detective had already clued me in, but I figured Ryan and his parents living here with you must know too. So I brought something even more interesting," I said, and the atmosphere immediately tensed. Everyone held their breath in a hushed silence, wondering what revelation was coming next. Agnes looked at me anxiously, waiting for me to speak. When I finally did speak, the quiet was shattered and the situation took a drastic turn. "What I wanted to say is, the child you're pregnant with, Agnes, it's not Ryan's. It's from another man." Immediately, sweat formed on Agnes's forehead and her expression became rigid. Ryan, speechless, could only mutter, "What?" His parents, confused, slowly turned their gaze towards Agnes. Before our marriage, I had spent my savings on a detective, asking them to gather conclusive evidence and information that would be advantageous for me post-divorce. Normally, it would have been just providing photographic evidence, but I requested several extras. I wanted photos that clearly showed the date and time, and detailed investigative reports recorded at every step. In fact, I had already gathered enough evidence to confront Ryan and demand alimony on the day of the divorce petition. I knew why he only went out on Tuesdays and the second Sunday of every month. Those were Agnes's days off at her job. Ryan dug his own grave by writing the divorce papers himself, handing me an unexpected win. I had enough evidence to corner Ryan, but I thought it was too early. The detective had mentioned a dark shadow lingering around Agnes, so I asked for a more detailed investigation into her. It turned out she was indeed pregnant, and Ryan knew about it. This was somewhat expected. However, Agnes insisted on going to the doctor alone, stubbornly refusing to bring Ryan along. He seemed indifferent, but Agnes had a clear intention: to keep her other boyfriend, a married man with kids, from suspecting anything. It turns out the child is definitely his. This married man, unable to be with Agnes due to his family, agreed to cover all costs for prenatal care to childbirth and even pay a lump sum in child support to end their affair. The agreement was that once the baby was born and if a test confirmed it was his child, he would pay child support and settle their relationship. That's why that man always accompanied Agnes to the hospital, leaving no room for Ryan to get involved. Ryan, used to me attending fertility clinic appointments alone, didn't suspect anything different. I had collected evidence of Agnes going into the clinic with another man and even had decisive audio data, all stored on my smartphone. I presented all this evidence right there. Agnes's face gradually turned pale and her hands trembled slightly. Ryan, filled with anger, confronted Agnes, yelling, "Did you deceive me?" His parents were doing the same. I thought it was too much to gang up on a pregnant woman, so I intervened. "Enough. You're all embarrassing. You're all just as bad." Ryan, who cheated, his parents, who condoned it, and Agnes planning to divorce Ryan and raise another married man's child. All of you are behaving disgracefully. This is nothing but a low-level quarrel. After my outburst, everyone fell silent, unable to respond. There was no turning back now. I was resolved. Knowing Agnes's shocking secret, these people were unlikely to live together anymore. But I couldn't forgive Ryan for looking down on me while I was struggling with infertility treatments and then pretending to be kind to avoid suspicion after his affair. I've divorced Ryan, and I'm going to make sure you all pay for your sins. Agnes, you now have to raise 2 children alone, but you brought this upon yourself. So face the consequences. When I said this casually, Agnes turned even paler. "You knew I had another child? How? Where did you?" she stammered, unable to finish her sentence. Ryan and his parents furrowed their brows even deeper as I started explaining. For clarity, Agnes is a single mother, but her older child is being raised by her parents. They gave her some money, but with another child coming, things will change. Her parents are getting older, and she's been looking for a man to act as an ATM to help with childcare. I have evidence of her laughing about this with friends. Realizing that the term ATM was a veiled reference to himself, Ryan looked hurt, though he had no right to feel that way. His parents were flustered, and his mother, losing her earlier composure, said in a panic, "So Agnes's child isn't our grandchild? Then there's no reason for her to stay in this house. Leave right now." Agnes, in her desperation, started making excuses. "No, it is Ryan's child. Please believe me." But my sister-in-law, who had been silent, finally spoke up. "Now you think we'll believe that, Agnes? Don't you realize the mess you've made of people's lives?" Agnes fell silent at her sharp words. Then my sister-in-law dropped another bombshell. "Aren't you the mom of the boy who goes to our nursery? The one always dropped off by his elderly grandparents. His name wouldn't happen to be Jason, would it?" Agnes's eyes widened, and though she opened her mouth to respond, no words came out. Her silence confirmed my sister-in-law's suspicions. Shocked, my mother-in-law collapsed on the spot while my father-in-law looked between us, frantic. It was time to wrap things up. I presented Ryan with an ultrasound photo and said, "Thanks to fertility treatments, I'm pregnant with your child. I was going to tell you soon. But then the morning sickness got worse and your affair became certain. But make no mistake, this child is yours. We won't live together, but I expect you to pay child support in full." Ryan looked despairing, but his brazen mother raised her head and started, "If you're having a child, you're still fit to be his wife. We were just misled by this woman. Apologize, and Margaret, please stay." I ignored my mother-in-law and turned to leave. When she kept calling after me, I turned back just once. "What are you doing?" You never liked me from the start. When you found out Agnes was pregnant with Ryan's child, what did you do? Your audacity knows no bounds. Stunned by my retort, something I'd never done before, my mother-in-law looked down again. My father-in-law, perhaps realizing their folly, said nothing more. I had already decided I didn't need to be recognized as their daughter-in-law, especially since they had discarded me. As I stepped outside, our sister-in-law apologized repeatedly, asking if there was anything she could do. I replied, just make sure they don't flee. I'm going to keep my distance from Ryan and communicate through a lawyer. And from now on, let's keep in touch as friends. She looked surprised but then nodded, saying, let's get through this together. Later, I hired a lawyer and went through the division of property. They whined about not being able to pay the substantial amount, but when I said I'd pursue this to the end in court with no mercy, they reluctantly agreed. As for Agnes, her affair with the married man came to light, leading to a heated argument. The turmoil grew too large, eventually reaching his wife's ears, and things did not end smoothly. Agnes, in desperation, turned to her parents for help. Naturally, they were furious with her and dragged her to us to apologize. After giving birth, Agnes will have no choice but to work tirelessly from dawn to dusk, unlikely to ever have the chance to engage in infidelity again. Despite having children, Agnes had been irresponsibly carefree, but now her parents control all her earnings, leaving her no room for stress relief. Having lived selfishly until now, she should start living for her children. Meanwhile, Ryan's fate turned out to be a mess as well. He eventually had to sell his family home to raise child support. Now he's living in a cramped, rundown apartment with his parents, barely getting by. I initially agreed to let him pay child support in installments, but as expected, he fell behind, thinking he could get away with it, probably based on something he read online. He was mistaken. I had warned I would be relentless. I immediately took legal action, enforcing payment through the courts. This led to his employer finding out about the divorce and his child support delinquency. His previous actions of leaving work early under the pretense of supporting his wife's fertility treatment, only to spend time with Agnes, also came to light, subjecting him to scorn. Eventually, he quit his job and paid the child support in full with a loan, plunging him into a lifetime of debt. Ryan's parents, too, were caught in the fallout. Now Ryan works solely to pay off his debts, and his parents, unable to enjoy a comfortable retirement, had to return to work. Their daily irresponsible arguments, blaming each other, even led to the police being called for being a neighborhood nuisance. Now they're quietly working to manage their debt, complaining as they do. As for me, I went back to my parents' house, apologized, and decided to live with them for a while after the birth. With their support, things started to look up. Soon, my former employer offered me a full-time position again. My sister-in-law, working at the daycare, agreed to take care of my daughter, giving me some peace of mind. Now, as a single mother living independently from my parents, I'm managing well. Thanks to the support and kind words from those around me, I've resolved to cherish these invaluable relationships and raise my daughter to be a wonderful person.
My name is Erica, and I never thought I'd be caught up in a family drama that would change my life forever. At 29, I was living a pretty ordinary life in the city. For the past 5 years, I'd been working as a secretary at Global Tech, a big corporation downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills for my small rented apartment. Weekends were my escape. I'd throw myself into dance classes, losing myself in the rhythm and forgetting about the pile of paperwork waiting for me on Monday. It wasn't much, but it was my life, and I was content. Family, though? That was complicated. I had a younger sister, Emily, who'd always been the golden child. From the day she was born, our mother doted on her like she was made of spun sugar. Dad, well, he just fell in line with whatever Mom wanted. It was always Emily this and Emily that. I tried not to be bitter, but it was hard not to feel like a shadow in my own family. As years went by, the distance between us grew. Phone calls became less frequent, visits even more so. I'd see pictures on social media of family gatherings I wasn't invited to, Emily always front and center, beaming with our parents. It stung, but I told myself I was better off focusing on my own life. That's why I nearly dropped my phone when Mom's number flashed on my screen one Tuesday evening. I hesitated before answering, bracing myself for whatever drama might be on the other end. "Erica, it's your mother," her voice crackled through the speaker. "Hi, Mom," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Is everything okay?" "Your father wants to see you," she said, cutting straight to the chase. "Can you come to the house this weekend?" "Saturday at 2 p.m. Don't be late." And with that, she hung up. I stared at my phone, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. What could be so important that Dad wanted to see me after all this time? Part of me wanted to ignore the invitation, to protect myself from inevitable disappointment. But curiosity won out. I'd go, if only to find out what was going on. As I stood outside my parents' expensive home that Saturday, I took a deep breath. The house looked the same as always, a monument to my parents' success and a reminder of the life I'd never quite fit into. I rang the doorbell, half expecting no one to answer, half hoping no one would. The door swung open, and there stood my mother, her face a mask of polite indifference. "You're here," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Everyone's in the living room." Seated in the plush living room were my father, looking pale and drawn, my sister Emily, and her husband, James. The atmosphere was tense, thick with unspoken words and hidden agendas. I perched on the edge of an armchair, feeling like an outsider in my own family home. Up close, I could see how ill Dad looked. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes seemed sunken. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this wasn't just a casual family gathering. "I've got something to tell you all," Dad continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. I'm terminally ill. The doctors say I don't have much time left." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gasped, tears springing to my eyes. Despite our strained relationship, I loved my father. The thought of losing him was unbearable. "Daddy," I choked out, reaching for his hand. He squeezed mine weakly, a sad smile on his face. Emily let out a dramatic sob, burying her face in her husband's shoulder. Mom sat stone-faced, her lips pressed into a thin line. I wondered how long they'd known, how long they'd kept this from me. "There's more," Dad said, his voice growing stronger. "I've made some decisions about my will." The room fell silent. Even Emily's sobs quieted as everyone leaned in, listening intently. "Mary," Dad said, looking at Mom, "you'll get the apartment in the city." Mom nodded curtly, as if this was expected. "Emily, the house will be yours." My sister's eyes lit up, a smile breaking through her tears. Then Dad turned to me, and I saw a determination in his eyes I'd never seen before. "Erica, I've decided to leave you my savings. All of it. $800,000. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. $800,000? It was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. But more than that, it felt like acknowledgement, a way of making up for years of being overlooked. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, all hell broke loose. Emily jumped to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "Dad, that's not fair. Erica's barely even part of this family anymore." "She doesn't deserve it," Mom hissed, glaring at me as if I'd somehow orchestrated this. "John, you need to exclude her from the will. Now." I sat there, stunned, as my mother and sister railed against me. And then Dad slammed his fist on the coffee table, the sound echoing through the room. "Enough," he roared, his face flushed with anger. "This is my decision, and I won't change it." Turning to Mom, his eyes blazing, he continued, "I've been under your influence for far too long, Mary. I've neglected Erica because of you, and it ends now." The room fell silent once more. I stared at my father, seeing him in a new light. For the first time in my life, he was standing up for me. Dad turned to me then, his anger melting into sorrow. "Erica, can you ever forgive me? I've been a terrible father to you." Tears streaming down my face, I moved to him, wrapping my arms around his frail frame. "I forgive you, Dad," I whispered. "I love you." We held each other for a long moment, years of hurt and misunderstanding flowing away. When we finally separated, Dad looked exhausted. I need to rest now, he said, slowly getting to his feet. Erica, thank you for coming. As Dad left the room, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Mom stepped forward, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Listen here, Erica. You need to do the right thing and give up your share of the inheritance. No, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I won't give it up. Dad wants me to have it, and I'm respecting his wishes. Emily's face contorted with rage. She stepped closer, her finger jabbing at my chest. You'll regret this, Erica. Mark my words. Over the next 2 weeks, my phone buzzed constantly with messages from Mom and Emily. Each one demanded I give up the inheritance, their tone growing increasingly hostile and threatening. I ignored them all, focusing on work and my dance classes, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning, I got the call I'd been dreading. Dad had passed away in his sleep. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and somber faces. Mom and Emily put on a show of grief, wailing dramatically and clutching each other. I noticed Emily wearing an obscenely expensive necklace and bracelet set, the diamonds catching the light as she dabbed at her dry eyes. After the service, we gathered at the house. I watched in disgust as Emily made a show of removing her jewelry, tucking it into her purse with exaggerated care. As the last of the guests trickled out, I gathered my things, eager to escape. That's when all hell broke loose. My jewelry, Emily shrieked, her hands flying to her face in mock horror. It's gone. Someone's stolen it. Mom's eyes locked onto me, her gaze accusing. Well. Isn't it convenient that the only person who's been here all day is the one who stands to gain so much? I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized what was happening. They were setting me up. You can't be serious, I sputtered. I didn't take anything. Emily's husband stepped forward, his voice oozing false concern. Then you won't mind showing us what's in your purse, right, Erica? I clutched my bag tighter, my mind racing. I knew I was innocent, but something told me that wouldn't matter if I opened my purse. No, I said firmly. I don't have to prove anything to you. Emily's husband pulled out his phone. Then you leave me no choice. I'm calling the police. As he dialed, I saw a triumphant smirk flash across Emily's face. In that moment, I realized just how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. I stood frozen, my heart pounding as 2 officers entered the house. Emily immediately launched into a tearful account of her stolen jewelry, painting herself as the grieving daughter, victimized on the day of her father's funeral. Officers, Emily's husband said, his voice dripping with false concern. We have reason to believe Erica may have taken the jewelry. She's refusing to show us the contents of her purse. The older of the 2 officers turned to me, his face impassive. Ma'am, would you mind opening your purse for us? I felt trapped, knowing that whatever happened next would not end well for me. With shaking hands, I opened my purse. The officer looked inside, and his expression hardened. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us, he said, reaching into my purse and pulling out Emily's necklace and bracelet. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This isn't possible, I stammered. I didn't take these. I'm being set up. But my protests fell on deaf ears. Mom and Emily launched into a tirade, calling me a thief, a liar, hurling insults that cut deeper than any knife. As the officers led me out, I caught a glimpse of Emily's smug smile, hidden behind her hand as she pretended to sob. At the police station, I sat in a stark interrogation room, still in my funeral clothes, trying to make sense of what had happened. Hours passed, and then the door opened. To my surprise, it was my mother who walked in, not a police officer. She dismissed the officer standing guard, insisting on speaking to me alone. As soon as the door closed behind her, Mom's demeanor changed entirely. Gone was the grieving widow, replaced by a cold, calculating woman I barely recognized. Listen carefully, Erica, she hissed, leaning close. You have one chance to fix this mess. Give up the inheritance. Sign it over to Emily, and all of this goes away. The charges, the scandal, everything. I stared at her, disbelief warring with a growing sense of betrayal. You set me up? Your own daughter? Mom's laugh was harsh and humorless. Oh, please. You stopped being part of this family long ago. Now, you have a choice. Give up the money, or we'll make sure you go to prison. Think about it, Erica. A thief who stole from her own sister at their father's funeral? Your reputation will be ruined. You'll lose everything. I felt sick to my stomach, the full weight of their betrayal crashing down on me. No, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I won't do it. I didn't steal anything, and I won't let you blackmail me. Mom's eyes flashed with anger. You ungrateful little rat, she spat. I hope you enjoy prison. Everyone will know what you did, stealing from your own family. You'll be nothing but a criminal, a disgrace. With that, she turned on her heel and left, slamming the door behind her. I sat there, stunned, tears streaming down my face as the reality of my situation sank in. I was released on bail later that night, stumbling out of the police station into the cool night air. My phone buzzed, a message from my boss at Global Tech. My stomach dropped as I read it. Erica, I've heard some disturbing rumors. Until the situation is resolved, I think it's best you take some time off. Paid leave, of course. I believe in your innocence, but we need to protect the company's reputation. Take care. I leaned against the cold brick wall of the station, feeling my world crumbling around me. In the span of a day, I'd lost my father, been betrayed by my family, arrested, and now I was on the verge of losing my job. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. With trembling fingers, I searched online for private investigators in the area. One name stood out, Jack Reeves, a former police detective turned PI with a reputation for solving complex cases. I made the call, my voice steadier than I expected as I explained my situation. Ms. Thompson, Jack said after I finished my story, this is a delicate situation. Family conspiracies are never easy to prove. But if what you're saying is true, we'll find evidence. It won't be cheap, though. I thought of the inheritance I was fighting for. Money's not an issue. I need to clear my name and expose what they've done. The next 3 weeks were a blur of clandestine meetings with Jack, anxious waiting, and sleepless nights. I threw myself into my dance classes on weekends, desperate for any distraction from the constant worry. My phone remained silent, no calls from work, no more threats from my family. The silence was almost worse than the conflict. Then, one rainy afternoon, my phone rang. It was Jack. Erica, he said, his voice grave. I've got news, but you're not going to like it. My heart sank. What is it, Jack? He sighed heavily. I've been following your mother and sister, trying to catch them discussing the inheritance or the theft. But they're careful, too careful. They never talk about it in public, and I can't legally bug their homes. I felt the last glimmer of hope fading. So that's it? There's nothing we can do? Not exactly, Jack replied, a note of hesitation in his voice. I did find something, but it's not related to your case. It's about your sister. I sat up straighter. What about her? She's having an affair, Erica. I have photographic evidence of her entering a hotel with a young man, definitely not her husband. I also managed to record some of their conversations. It's not flattering to her husband, to say the least. For a moment, I sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, a plan began to form in my mind. Jack, I said, my voice low and determined, I need you to send me everything you have on this. And I mean everything. As soon as I hung up, I sprang into action. I spent the next hour poring over the photos and recordings Jack sent, my mind racing with possibilities. Finally, I made a decision. I selected the most damning photo, my sister entering the hotel with her young lover, and sent it to her husband's phone with a simple message. Interested in knowing what happened next? Meet me at Café Luna tomorrow at 2 p.m. The next day, I arrived at the cafe early, my nerves on edge. At exactly 2 p.m., Emily's husband walked in, his face a mask of barely contained fury and curiosity. "What's this about, Erica?" he demanded as he sat down across from me. I took a deep breath. "I think you know, James. But what you've seen is just the tip of the iceberg." Over the next hour, I laid out everything I had. The photos, the recordings of Emily laughing about James's age, mocking his performance in bed, discussing her plans to leave him once she got her hands on the full inheritance. James sat in stunned silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. When I finished, he looked up at me, his eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and rage. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I leaned forward. "I want justice, James. And I think you do too. Help me prove that they framed me, and we can both get what we deserve." A few days after my meeting with James, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from him, containing several audio files. My heart raced as I pressed play on the first one. Emily's voice filled the air. "Can you believe how easy it was to plant that jewelry in Erica's purse?" My mother's laughter followed. "I know. The look on her face when the police found it was priceless. Well, she'll have no choice but to give it up now." I listened to file after file, each one filled with their callous plotting and cruel laughter. A mix of vindication and disgust washed over me. Finally, I had the proof I needed. The day of the will reading arrived quickly. I entered the notary's office, my stomach in knots, but my resolve firm. Mom and Emily were already there, shooting me smug looks. James sat quietly in the corner, giving me an almost imperceptible nod. The notary, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "Let's begin," he said, unfolding the document before him. He read through the will, detailing the distribution of assets, just as Dad had explained that day at the house. As he finished, I stood up. "If I may," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "there's something I need to address before we conclude." Mom's eyes lit up, and she nodded approvingly. "I'm glad you've finally come to your senses, Erica. I knew you'd make the right decision and give up the inheritance." Mom and Emily exchanged triumphant glances, their faces beaming with anticipation. But I was about to disappoint them. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood," I said, pulling out my phone. "I think you'll all want to hear this." I pressed play, and the room filled with their voices, gleefully discussing how they had framed me for theft. As the recording played, I watched the color drain from their faces. Emily let out a strangled gasp, while Mom sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. When it ended, chaos erupted. "You lying scum!" Emily screeched, lunging towards me. "How dare you!" Mom hissed, her composure cracking. "You ungrateful, scheming." I recorded those conversations. James suddenly spoke up, his voice cutting through the commotion. The room descended into madness. Emily was screaming at James, Mom was hurling insults at me, and I stood there, watching it all unfold. "Silence!" The notary's voice boomed, startling us all into quiet. "This is a legal proceeding, not a circus. Everyone will calm down this instant, or I'll have you all removed." As the notary's words echoed through the room, a heavy silence fell. It was broken by James, who stood up abruptly, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Since we're airing dirty laundry," he said, his voice trembling with anger, "I have something to add." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, slapping it down on the table in front of Emily. Emily's face drained of color as she stared at the image. It showed her entering a hotel with a man who was decidedly not her husband. "I know everything, Emily," James spat. "Your affair, your lies, all of it. I'm filing for divorce, and thanks to our prenup, you won't see a penny. You'll be paying me compensation for your infidelity." Emily's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no words coming out. Mom looked between Emily and James, her expression a mix of shock and dawning horror as she realized their carefully constructed world was crumbling around them. Suddenly, the door to the notary's office swung open. 2 police officers walked in, their faces stern. Mary and Emily Thompson, one of them asked, though it was clear he already knew who they were. Mom and Emily looked up, tears streaking their faces. "You're under arrest for false accusations of theft and attempted blackmail," the officer continued. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the police read them their rights and handcuffed them, I watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was justice, but it was also the final nail in the coffin of our family relationship. I walked out of the office behind the police, watching as they put Mom and Emily into separate patrol cars. As the sirens faded into the distance, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was over. Taking out my phone, I dialed a familiar number. "Erica," my boss's voice came through, sounding concerned. "Is everything all right?" "Better than all right," I replied, a smile in my voice. "I can explain everything now. The accusations against me were false, and I have proof." I gave him a brief rundown of what had happened. As I finished, I heard him let out a low whistle. "Erica, I'm so sorry you had to go through all that," he said, genuine sympathy in his voice. "But I'm glad the truth came out. Listen, your job is still here whenever you're ready to come back. In fact, I'd be delighted to see you at work as soon as you feel up to it." The weeks following the confrontation at the notary's office were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and life-changing decisions. As the truth came to light, the charges against me were quickly dropped. The relief I felt was indescribable, like a weight I'd been carrying for months suddenly lifted from my shoulders. But for Mom and Emily, the nightmare was just beginning. They faced charges of false accusation and attempted blackmail. The trial was swift and damning, with the recorded evidence leaving no room for doubt. In the end, they were found guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern-faced woman with piercing eyes, looked down at them from her bench. In addition to the criminal penalties, this court orders Mary and Emily Thompson to pay substantial damages to Erica Thompson for emotional distress and damage to her reputation. The fine was staggering. Mom's face went pale as the amount was read out, while Emily burst into tears. In the days that followed, I watched from a distance as their lives unraveled. Mom, with no other choice, was forced to sell the apartment Dad had left her. It was a beautiful place in the heart of the city, but now it slipped from her grasp, the proceeds going straight to me as part of the damages. Emily's situation was even more dire. The house she'd been so smug about inheriting had to be sold to cover her part of the fine. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction as I remembered her gloating face the day Dad announced his will. But Emily's troubles didn't end there. James, true to his word, filed for divorce. He demanded the compensation outlined in their prenuptial agreement for her infidelity. What little money was left from the sale of the house went straight to him. In the span of a few short months, Mom and Emily had lost everything. Their comfortable lives, their social standing, their financial security, all of it gone. They were left with nothing but the consequences of their own actions. As for me, I found myself in a position I'd never dreamed possible. With the inheritance from Dad and the damages from Mom and Emily, I had more money than I knew what to do with. After much thought, I decided to buy a beautiful apartment in a quiet part of town. It was everything I'd ever wanted in a home, spacious, bright, and most importantly, mine. The rest of the money, I invested carefully. I spent hours researching, consulting with financial advisors, and making prudent decisions. My goal was to ensure a steady income for years to come, to build the security that I'd always longed for. As I stood in my new apartment, looking out over the city skyline, I couldn't help but reflect on the tumultuous journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the fight for justice, it had all led to this moment. I thought of Mom and Emily, now struggling to make ends meet. Part of me felt sorry for them, but a larger part knew that they were facing the consequences of their own choices. They had tried to take everything from me, and in the end, they'd lost it all themselves. My phone buzzed with a message from my boss, confirming my return to work next week. I smiled, looking forward to getting back to normal, or rather, my new normal. I wiped down the last table at Joe's Cafe, glancing at the clock that ticked steadily towards my freedom for the night. The diner's neon sign buzzed in the evening calm, a beacon for the occasional late-night wanderer looking for a cup of joe or a piece of pie. My apron, splattered with today's special, felt heavier with each passing minute. My shift was finally ending, and the real work, the kind that fueled my dreams, was about to begin. "Mama, I'm heading out to the Rusty Nail. They asked me to do a couple of sets tonight," I called, my voice echoing slightly in the now empty cafe. From the back, amidst the clatter of dishes, Mom's voice came, tired yet always supportive. "Sing like the angels, Elena. Make 'em listen." Inside the Rusty Nail, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The warmth of dim lights and the murmur of scattered conversations welcomed me like an old friend. I headed straight to the tiny stage that was more an afterthought than a feature. The owner, a burly man with a smile that could light up the room, gave me a nod. "Got a good crowd tonight, Luna. Some big shot producers amongst 'em. Make it count." Luna. The name still felt new, but Mr. Carter, the producer who'd taken a chance on me a few days back, insisted it was sonorous and memorable. He was in the crowd tonight, his sharp eyes missing nothing. The set started off with some of my favorites, the notes of each song weaving through the smoky air, creating a tapestry of sound that seemed to hold the room in a trance. I poured every ounce of my soul into the lyrics, each word a testament to the years of dreaming and striving. Halfway through a particularly heartfelt ballad, I caught Mr. Carter's eye. He was nodding slightly, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. After my set, I made my way to his table, my heart pounding not from the singing but from what this conversation could mean. "Elena, you were phenomenal," Mr. Carter said, his voice smooth like aged whiskey. "That voice of yours needs bigger stages." I blushed, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I'm just glad to have the gigs." He slid a card across the table. "I want you to join a course at my vocal school. Sharpen those raw edges. And then, who knows? Maybe open for some big names?" As I walked home later, under the speckled canvas of the night sky, every step felt lighter. I was going to work harder, shine brighter. Mr. Carter believed in Luna, but more importantly, I believed in myself. Ever since Mr. Carter roped me into this whirlwind of vocal drills and endless rehearsals, my life's been nothing short of a mad dash from one microphone to the next. The vocal school was tougher than anything I'd ever faced. Every day was a grind, but every note I belted out made me feel like I was inching closer to something big, something life-changing. "Elena, you're flat on the high C. Again. Focus," barked Mr. Jennings, the vocal coach who had a way of making you feel like you were back in grade school. "Sorry, I got it this time. Just, give me a sec," I replied, wiping the sweat from my brow and squaring my shoulders. "Take 5, everyone. But not you, Luna. Let's get this right," he commanded, not even looking up from his clipboard. As everyone else scattered toward the break room, I took a deep breath and prepared myself for another go. Mr. Jennings played the piano keys, giving me the cue. Hold it, there. That's it, Luna. Why can't you hit it like that every time?" he said, a rare smile breaking through his usually stern demeanor. "Just needed to warm up, I guess," I shot back with a grin, feeling a mix of relief and pride swelling inside me. Back in the break room, a couple of other students were huddled around a table, their eyes glued to their phones. "That was some note you hit there, Luna. Bet you could shatter glass with that," joked Alex, a fellow student with a knack for making everyone laugh. "Yeah, well, I'd settle for shattering expectations," I quipped, grabbing a water bottle from the fridge. The conversation turned to the upcoming showcase, where we were all supposed to demonstrate what we'd learned. It was a big deal, with scouts and agents in the audience. Just thinking about it made my stomach do flips. "You ready for the showcase, Luna? Heard some big names might be dropping by," said Alex, his tone turning serious. "Ready as I'll ever be. Just gotta keep my cool and show 'em what I'm made of," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The day of the showcase arrived faster than a freight train. Backstage, the air was thick with nerves and hairspray. Stepping out onto the stage, the lights blinded me for a moment. I could see shadows of people out in the audience, some shifting in their seats, others silent in anticipation. The music started, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It was just me and the song. I poured every ounce of emotion I had into the lyrics, letting the melody lift me higher and higher until the final note hung in the air like a promise. The applause that followed was deafening. I couldn't help but smile, basking in the sound of it all. As I walked off the stage, Mr. Carter was waiting in the wings, his usual stern expression replaced with something softer, something akin to pride. As I changed back into my regular clothes and prepared to leave, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Heard your showcase went great. So proud of you. Love you." Smiling, I typed back, "Thanks, Mom. Couldn't have gotten here without you. Love you more." Walking out into the night, the air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the evening itself was whispering of bigger stages and brighter lights just on the horizon. Life on the stage was like nothing else, and I was finally living it, big time. Mr. Carter had me opening for names that once felt like they belonged in a different universe. Each concert, each crowd was bigger, louder, more thrilling than the last. Then, at a charity gig decked out with chandeliers and swanky suits, I met David. He was one of those patrons, the kind you know have more money than they know what to do with, but he was different. He actually listened, really listened, when I sang. After my set, we got to talking and something just clicked. "Hey, you really stole the show tonight," he said, his smile easy, his eyes kind. "Thanks, I guess I just tried to give it my all," I replied, trying to sound more casual than I felt. We started seeing each other, and it wasn't long before it turned into something real, something deep. On our 1-year anniversary, he took me to this little secluded spot overlooking the city, got down on one knee, and popped the question. My heart nearly burst out of my chest. "Yes. Of course, yes." I blurted out before he even finished asking. It was like a fairy tale, at least until the day he decided it was time I met his parents. The nerves I felt performing in front of thousands didn't come close to the anxiety of meeting David's mother. The way she looked me up and down when David introduced me, it was clear she had already formed her opinion before even a hello. "So, Elena, David tells me you're a singer. At restaurants, is it?" Her voice dripped with something colder than disdain. "Yes, Mrs. Westwood. I perform at various venues," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. David squeezed my hand under the table, a silent plea for me to stay cool. "Well, I suppose we all do what we can with what we're given," she sighed, as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders just thinking about my upbringing. David's father, Mr. Westwood, was a stark contrast. He arrived a few days later from a business trip, and right away, he was warm and engaging. "Elena has quite the voice, Dad. She's opened for some pretty big names." David beamed, proud as could be. "That's fantastic. Music's a tough field. Takes a lot of grit," Mr. Westwood replied, his nod filled with a respect that felt like a balm to the burn Mrs. Westwood had left. But the relief was short-lived. Mrs. Westwood's comments grew sharper, more frequent. "One must wonder how a young lady gets so far in such an industry. Surely not by keeping her virtue intact," she once remarked during a dinner, her words slicing through the air like a knife. I felt my face go hot, my hands clench into fists under the table. "Mr. Carter has been nothing but a mentor to me, Mrs. Westwood." "Oh, come now, dear. We all know how these things work. A girl without a father figure is often looking for one, isn't she?" She chuckled, as if it was just a bit of harmless fun. Her refusal to see me as worthy gnawed at me, her words echoing in my head long after they were spoken. But David stood by me, his love unwavering. "Don't listen to her, Elena. You're amazing, and that's all that matters." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But as we started planning our wedding, Mrs. Westwood's shadow loomed large, making me wonder if I'd ever really be part of their family. The morning of my wedding, I woke up with a belly full of butterflies and a heart overflowing with love. David and I had poured our souls into every detail of the wedding. It was the day we had both been dreaming of. The venue was draped in delicate whites and soft pinks, every petal and candle placed with care. It was perfect, just like I'd always imagined. As I slipped into my dress, a stunning number that made me feel like a star in one of those fancy romance flicks, I couldn't help but catch my mom's teary-eyed smile in the mirror. The ceremony started with a swell of music, and as I walked down the aisle, all eyes on me, I saw David at the altar, looking like he'd won the lottery. My nerves settled, replaced by a fierce joy. This was it. This was our moment. As we stood before the priest, hand in hand, the traditional question came: if anyone has any reason why these two should not be married, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence that followed was expected. What wasn't expected was the sharp click of a heel and a voice that cut through the quiet like a knife. I have something to say. It was Mrs. Westwood, standing up in her finery, her face set in a mask of disapproval. Murmurs swirled through the gathered crowd as she started her tirade. This girl, Elena, is nothing but an uneducated dropout who grew up without a father. Her mother conceived her with the first man she met. Do we even know his name? The room went dead quiet, every word from her lips a slap to my face. I felt David's grip tighten around my hands, his jaw clenched. She barely scraped through school, and sings at night in eateries, in front of all sorts of men. This is not the kind of woman fit for our family, Mrs. Westwood declared, her voice ringing in the hall. Before I could shrink away, David stepped forward, his voice firm and loud. Mom, stop. I love Elena. Her past doesn't matter to me. I know her heart, her strength, and her character. That's the woman I chose to marry. His words seemed to silence the room even further, if that was possible. Mrs. Westwood looked stunned, her mouth snapping shut as she realized her son was not on her side this time. The priest cleared his throat. Shall we continue? With a nod from us both, the ceremony went on, but the poison of her words lingered, making my hands tremble and my heart race. It wasn't until the music started for our first dance that I felt a shift. David pulled me close, his hand warm on my back. Forget everyone else. It's just you and me now, he murmured as we swayed to the music. The first dance with David was like a dream. As we glided across the floor, his promises still echoing in my heart, I almost believed that the worst was over. As the last note of our song faded, Mrs. Westwood, flushed from too much champagne, stumbled to the center of the room, grabbing a microphone from the DJ. Such a lovely tradition, the father-daughter dance. Pity we won't see one tonight, eh? She slurred, her voice dripping with mockery. A hush fell over the room. I felt every eye on me, the weight of their stares like a blanket of ice. David's grip tightened on my hand, his whisper urgent. Ignore her, Elena, please. Before I could even muster a response, the side door creaked open, and a man, disheveled and dirty, staggered into the spotlight. My heart sank as Mrs. Westwood's cruel laughter cut through the stunned silence. Look here, perhaps this is Elena's father ready for their dance, she jeered. The room erupted in confused murmurs, some gasps, others hushed whispers. I felt my cheeks burn, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. I covered my face, unable to bear the spectacle. Suddenly, the sharp clack of heels announced my mother's arrival on the stage. Her voice, usually so gentle, was steel as she confronted Mrs. Westwood. This isn't a joke, Diane. You've gone too far. Apologize to my daughter, now. Mom demanded, her presence commanding silence. Mrs. Westwood, swaying slightly, just scoffed, her sneer evident even through her slurred words. Oh, come off it, it's just a bit of fun. Lighten up. That's when Mr. Westwood, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his face dark with anger. Diane, enough. What are you thinking? He turned to the audience, his voice carrying a mix of embarrassment and authority. This man is an actor, hired by my wife as a distasteful joke. I apologize to everyone here, especially to Elena and her family. He then turned sharply to his wife. You need to leave, now. With a huff, Mrs. Westwood tossed the microphone down and stormed out, her exit as dramatic as her antics. As the door slammed behind her, the tension seemed to deflate slightly, and Mom came over to me, pulling me into a tight embrace. "It's okay, baby. Let's not let her ruin your day," she whispered, smoothing back my hair as I fought to regain my composure. "You all right to keep going?" David asked, his eyes searching mine for any sign of retreat. I nodded, wiping my eyes. "Yeah, let's finish this. For us." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dances, toasts, and laughter, so much so that by the end of the night, I had almost forgotten the cruel stunt Mrs. Westwood had pulled. Almost, but not quite. Every now and then, the memory would resurface, a sharp stab reminding me that despite the beautiful vows and the joyous celebration, a shadow lingered over our new beginning. Ever since the wedding, Mrs. Westwood had been quieter, but a tiger doesn't change its stripes overnight. When she called me about a charity event she was organizing, her voice had that same old chill. "Elena, you should come to the charity concert next weekend. There will be some truly talented singers there. It might be educational for you," she said, her words dripping with that familiar condescension. I bit my tongue to keep from snapping back. "Sounds lovely, Diane. Who's performing?" She hesitated, a scoff hidden just beneath her breath. "Oh, various artists. I can't quite remember all their names." Typical Diane, setting the stage to belittle me. But I played along. "Well, I'd love to attend. Thanks for the invitation." That very night, Mr. Carter, my producer, called with some interesting news. "Luna, you're set to perform at a charity event next Saturday. It's a big gig, lots of high rollers." I paused, a slow grin spreading across my face as I connected the dots. This wouldn't happen to be the Westwood charity concert, would it? "That's the one. How'd you guess?" Mr. Carter chuckled on the other end. "Just a lucky guess," I replied, my mind already ticking. "Carter, let's keep it under wraps that Luna is actually Elena Westwood, okay? I want it to be a surprise." He laughed, clearly amused by the idea. "You got it, Luna. They'll only see your stage name." The night of the concert, the venue was buzzing with the city's elite, all finely dressed and ready to be entertained. Mrs. Westwood was fluttering around like a peacock, greeting donors and flashing her insincere smiles. As I arrived, hidden behind the stage, I could hear her addressing the crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight. Your generosity supports a great cause. And now, please welcome the sensational Luna." The crowd clapped politely, some craning their necks to see the rising star Mrs. Westwood had boasted about. I took a deep breath and stepped into the spotlight. The hush that fell was delicious. As the first few notes of the song filled the air, I began to sing, pouring every ounce of my passion into the words. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mrs. Westwood's rigid posture falter. She fumbled with her phone, probably texting Mr. Carter in a panic. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous. I took my bow, my heart soaring as the applause washed over me. It wasn't just a performance, it was a victory. Stepping off stage, I caught snippets of conversations, praises mingled with surprise. "Wasn't that Elena Westwood? Diane's daughter-in-law?" "Yes, the very one. Who would have thought?" Mrs. Westwood cornered me backstage, her face a mask of fury barely contained. "What is this stunt? You embarrassed me in front of all my guests." I met her glare with a calm I didn't feel. "Diane, I was invited to sing. I just did my job. You said yourself you wanted to hear from talented singers." Her lips thinned into a line, and for a moment, I thought she might cause another scene. But she turned on her heel and stormed off instead. After my performance, David and I stood hand in hand, soaking in the success of the evening. My heart was still racing from the thrill of it all, but that high crashed down when Mrs. Westwood took the stage again. Her face twisted with disdain, she grabbed the microphone from the MC. "While the voice may be delightful, let's not forget who we're applauding," she sneered, her voice echoing through the hall. "This famous singer, ladies and gentlemen, is nothing but a bastard born of unknowns, and it's my duty to remind her fans of her true origins." The crowd murmured, the atmosphere thickening with tension. I felt my face drain of color, anger seething within me. Before I could react, my mom stepped onto the stage, elegant and composed, flanked by a man I'd never seen, a bit older than David. "Enough, Diane." Mom's voice was calm, but carried an undeniable edge. "I've had enough of your humiliations toward me and my daughter. It's time some truths came to light." She paused, giving the man next to her a nod. He stepped forward, an envelope in hand. "After Elena's wedding, I hired a detective. We discovered some intriguing facts about Diane here." Mom continued, her eyes locked on Mrs. Westwood, who paled under the scrutiny. "Years ago, Diane got pregnant by her boyfriend, who promptly abandoned her. Alone and desperate, she met her future husband online. Pretending to want a long correspondence, she actually planned to give up her baby at birth." The murmurs grew louder, the guests shifting uncomfortably as they absorbed the gravity of Mom's words. "But fate intervened," Mom said. "She kept the baby and met her husband, never revealing her past." The man beside Mom stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I am that baby. Diane is my mother, abandoned me, and I was raised by foster parents. All my life, I've dreamed of meeting her, my biological mother." He held up the envelope. "This DNA test confirms everything. Diane, you are my mother, and David is my brother." The hall erupted into whispers and gasps. Mrs. Westwood's face crumpled, her usual poise crumbling as the reality of her deceit was laid bare for all to see. Mr. Westwood, who had been standing off to the side, his expression unreadable, finally spoke, his voice booming over the noise. "I can't believe this, Diane. To think you've lied about something so fundamental. I need time to think about all of this." Mr. Westwood turned and left the hall, his shoulders heavy. The crowd's buzzing grew louder, filled with indignation and shock at the duplicity of Mrs. Westwood. Amidst the chaos, she fled the room, her departure as dramatic as her life had been deceptive. Mr. Carter, who had been watching from the sidelines, approached us, a supportive smile on his face. "Elena, why don't you give us one more song? One about honesty and love, perhaps?" Nodding, I took the stage again. The opening notes of the song filled the room, a melody about truth and the courage it takes to face it. As I sang, the earlier tension dissipated, replaced by a collective catharsis. The applause at the end was overwhelming, not just for the performance, but for the truth. As it rang out, I saw my mom wiping away tears of pride. After the fiasco that blew up at the charity event, things changed drastically for everyone involved. Mrs. Westwood, once the queen bee of her social circles, found herself isolated after the divorce. Mr. Westwood couldn't see past the deception, and he ended their marriage, leaving her with nothing but a modest allowance. I heard through the grapevine that her former friends turned their backs, snubbing her from gatherings and charity events that she once dominated. It's like she vanished from the social scene entirely. Meanwhile, my career took off in ways I never imagined. The scandal put the spotlight on me, and not just as a singer. People were touched by the story, by the struggle and the strength it took to face down such public betrayal. Mr. Carter called me about starting my first album. "Luna, it's time to channel all this into your music. Are you ready to start on your album?" he said over the phone, his voice brimming with excitement. "You bet I am, Carter. Let's show them what I'm made of," I replied, feeling the fire of anticipation lighting up inside me. In the middle of all this, David and his newfound brother, Michael, grew close. It was a silver lining in a very dark cloud. They met up often, finding comfort and understanding in their shared, if complicated, family dynamics. One day, I sat down with my mom, the woman who stood by me through every high and every low. We were in her cozy kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee in the air. "Mom, I don't know how to ever thank you enough. You've been my rock," I started, my voice thick with emotion. "Honey, you don't need to thank me. I did what any mother would do. Plus, seeing you handle everything with such grace, that's all the thanks I need," she said, her eyes misty as she sipped her coffee. As I got deeper into the process of creating my album, each song felt like a piece of my journey, a melody of my trials and triumphs. David was my constant supporter, and having Michael around brought a new dimension to our lives. It was strange how life worked out, but I was grateful for where we all ended up. My world changed drastically when I was just 5. Dad had passed away from a sudden heart attack, and not long after, Mom decided to remarry. His name was George. He had a rough look and even a rougher way of talking, something that seemed to scare me right from the get-go. George brought not just his belongings into our little home, but his daughter, Liza, who was 2 years my senior and, as I'd soon find out, twice as mean. I remember the first time I met Liza. She had this smug smile plastered across her face, looking down at me as if I was some sort of bug she found amusing. "So, you're the baby of the house?" "Well, not anymore. Better get used to it," Liza sneered, her eyes scanning me like I was her new project to fix or break. Mom tried to make things sound all sugar-coated when she talked about them moving in. "Ella, honey, it's going to be wonderful to have a bigger family. Liza will be like the older sister you never had." But Liza was no sister to me. The first few days she moved in, she laid down the law, her law. My toys weren't mine anymore, they were ours, which meant they were hers whenever she wanted. And when I protested? Well, let's just say George didn't like that at all. "Ella, stop being selfish. Learn to share with your sister," he'd grumble, his voice deep and usually laced with annoyance. Mom never stood up to him. Whenever I went to her, hoping she'd take my side just this once, she'd always have the same old tired lines. "Ella, please. Just try a little harder to get along. For me, okay?" She'd plead, her eyes always looking a bit too tired, a bit too sad. Liza knew she had the upper hand, and she milked it every chance she got. If she broke something, somehow it was my fault. If she lost something, somehow I had stolen it. But one particular afternoon sticks out in my memory like a sore thumb. Liza had been particularly cruel that day, hiding my favorite doll and claiming she had no idea where it was. I found it later, tossed in the trash can outside. I remember holding the dirty, slightly torn doll as I walked into the house, tears streaming down my face. "Look what she did, Mom. Look." I cried, holding up the doll for her to see. Mom glanced at the doll, then at my tear-stained face, and for a moment, I thought she'd finally see my side. But then her eyes shifted towards the living room where George was sitting, watching TV. "Ella, maybe it was an accident. Just let it go, please," she whispered, her voice tense as she glanced nervously towards the living room. Liza just laughed from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "Crybaby," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for me to hear. That night, as I lay in bed clutching the now clean but still ripped doll, I realized that this was my new normal. Liza wasn't going anywhere, and neither was George. And Mom, well, she was there but not really there for me. Things took a sharper turn when Mom announced she was pregnant. I remember feeling a mix of emotions. A little brother or sister could mean someone else on my side, right? Wrong. It just meant more reasons for Mom and George to pay attention to anything but me. Tommy was born on a chilly morning in November. He was a quiet baby, hardly ever cried, but he needed constant attention, as all babies do. Mom was either feeding him, changing him, or trying to catch a few minutes of sleep. And George? Well, he was over the moon about having a son. Liza and I were pushed further to the back burner. But while I felt more isolated, Liza seemed to relish it. It was like she thrived on the chaos, knowing she could get away with anything as the focus wasn't on us anymore. One evening, I was trying to finish some homework at the kitchen table, struggling to concentrate over the sound of Tommy's fussing. Liza waltzed in, dropped her bag on the table, and scattered my papers everywhere. "Hey, I was using those," I snapped, my frustration peaking. "So? Move over, I need the table," Liza retorted, not even looking at me as she started to rummage through her bag. Before I could say anything else, George stormed into the kitchen. What's all this noise about? Can't you see your mother's trying to get Tommy to sleep? Liza's trying to take over the table when I'm still using it, I said, standing my ground despite the knot in my stomach. George's face turned a shade I knew too well, and his voice was even and dangerous. Ella, stop your complaining and go to your room. Let your sister use the table. But Dad. He's not your dad. Don't call him that. Liza cut in, her words sharp and biting. That stung more than I expected, and without another word, I grabbed my things and stormed off to my room, slamming the door behind me. I pressed my back against it, sliding down to the floor as I fought back tears. I felt so alone, cornered in a house that no longer felt like home. After that night, I learned to keep my head down. Liza took advantage, of course, always finding new ways to torment me when no one else was looking. George never did anything about it. If anything, he seemed to agree with whatever Liza said, which only made her bolder. Shouldn't you be nicer to me? I mean, we're practically sisters. I once tried to reason with her, hoping to break through her tough exterior. Liza laughed, cold and harsh. We're not sisters. We're not even friends. Remember that. And I did. Every single day that I lived in that house, I remembered. My room became my sanctuary, the only place I felt somewhat safe. But even there, the sounds of a happy family, a family that didn't include me, filtered through the walls, a constant reminder of where I stood. As soon as I finished high school, I knew I had to get out. Staying in that house wasn't an option anymore. It was suffocating, like trying to breathe underwater. So, I moved to the city. It was a fresh start, a chance to be who I wanted to be without anyone hovering over me, dictating what I could or couldn't do. The first few weeks were tough. I remember walking into my tiny studio apartment for the first time, feeling a mix of excitement and terror. It was all on me now. No more Liza, no more George, just Ella, trying to make it on her own. I found a job at a local cafe to pay the bills and signed up for a nail technician course. Nails were something I always loved doing, a creative outlet that let me escape the real world for a bit. The course was tougher than I expected. The instructor, Mrs. Jenkins, was a stickler for perfection. If you're going to do it right, she'd often say, peering over her glasses as she inspected our work. I pushed through, got my license, and started looking for a place to set up shop. The perfect spot turned out to be a small room on the ground floor of an old building. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The landlady, Mrs. Petrov, was a tough old bird who'd seen it all. When I went to sign the lease, she eyed me skeptically. "You sure you can handle this, girlie? It's a tough business." I met her gaze, my resolve firm. "Yes, Mrs. Petrov. I can handle it." She grunted, handing over the keys. "We'll see. Pay your rent on time and we won't have any problems." Starting my own business was brutal. Money was tight, and there were days I barely made enough to cover lunch. But slowly, word got out. My clients liked my work, and they started bringing their friends. Positive reviews trickled in, and with each one, my confidence grew. Just when I thought I had everything figured out, life decided to throw me a curveball. It was a typical busy Tuesday when my phone rang, the screen flashing Mom, which usually meant something was up. I took a deep breath before answering. "Hi, Mom. What's up?" I tried to keep my tone light, but I was already bracing for whatever was coming. "Ella, sweetheart, I hope you're sitting down. I have a favor to ask," Mom began, her voice shaky, which immediately put me on edge. "I'm at work, Mom. What's going on?" I wiped my hands on a towel, stepping into the back room of my salon. "It's about your sister, Liza. She's moving to your city and needs a place to stay, just for a little while, until she finds a job," Mom explained, her words rushing out like she wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. I felt my stomach drop. "Liza? Mom, are you serious?" There was a heavy sigh from her end. I know it's a lot to ask, but she's trying to start over, Ella. She's changed, she really has." The idea of living with Liza again made my skin crawl, but hearing the pleading in Mom's voice, I was torn. "I don't know, Mom. Please, Ella. For me? It won't be for long, I promise." And just like that, I found myself agreeing to let Liza stay. "Fine, but just for a little while, okay?" "Thank you, darling. I'll let her know." The next day, Liza arrived at my doorstep with 2 suitcases and a smile that looked too sweet to be genuine. "Hey, Ella. Long time, no see, huh? Thanks for letting me crash here. I really appreciate it," she chirped, stepping inside before I could even respond. "Yeah, sure. Let's just make sure it's temporary, okay?" I said, eyeing her suitcases with suspicion. Liza laughed, a bit too loudly. "Of course. I'll be out of your hair before you know it." The first week wasn't as bad as I expected. Liza seemed like she was really trying to make an effort. She cleaned up after herself, made small talk, and even offered to split groceries. "So, how's the job hunt going?" I asked one evening as we shared a surprisingly pleasant dinner. Good. I've got a couple of interviews lined up next week," Liza replied, sounding optimistic. "That's great. Just remember, you can't stay here forever," I reminded her, not wanting her to get too comfortable. Liza nodded, her expression serious. "I know, Ella. And thanks again. I know I wasn't the best sister back in the day, but I'm trying to make things right." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But there was always that nagging doubt in the back of my mind, remembering all the times she had deceived me before. As days turned into weeks, I noticed a shift in Liza's behavior. She started coming home late, missing her interviews, and hanging out with a questionable crowd. The old Liza was resurfacing. "Liza, we need to talk," I finally said one night after she stumbled in past midnight. "What's up?" Liza slurred slightly, clearly having had a few drinks. "This isn't working. You said you'd look for a job, but all you're doing is partying. You need to get it together or find somewhere else to live," I said firmly, my patience wearing thin. Liza rolled her eyes, her old defiance flashing. "Chill, Ella. I'll get a job. Just relax." But I couldn't relax. Not with her in my house, disrupting the peace I had worked so hard to build. Liza's promises of job hunting had quickly dissolved into late nights and shady new friends who seemed to pop in and out of my apartment like it was a downtown bar. My patience was wearing thin, and I was close to kicking her out when I met Alex at a friend's party. Alex was different from anyone I'd ever met. He was genuine and seemed genuinely interested in what I did for a living, unlike most guys who glossed over it once they heard nail technician. "So, you really run your own business? That's pretty impressive," Alex said as we sat tucked away in a quieter corner of the noisy living room. "Yeah, it's been a wild ride, but I love it. It's mine, you know?" I replied, feeling a spark of pride flicker within. We started seeing each other, and things were going great, except for one thing, Liza. She had taken an unsettling interest in Alex. At first, it was just lingering looks, but then she started making excuses to stick around whenever he came over. It wasn't long before I caught her trying to be a little too friendly. One evening, I came home earlier than usual to find Liza draped a bit too close to Alex on the sofa, laughing at something he said. The scene made my blood boil. "Having fun?" I asked, my voice sharp as I dropped my keys on the counter a little louder than necessary. Liza jumped up, a guilty flush on her face. "Oh, hey, Ella. We were just chatting, you know, getting to know each other better." Alex looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Liza and me. "Yeah, just talking. Ella, can we chat for a sec?" I nodded, pulling him aside into the kitchen. Once out of earshot, I didn't waste time. "What was that all about?" Alex rubbed the back of his neck, looking genuinely confused. "I'm not sure. She's been really forward lately." I didn't want to say anything. I didn't know how to handle it without making things weird for you. Determined to put an end to it, I confronted Liza later that night. "We need to talk, now," I said, standing at the entrance of her room. She looked up, feigning innocence. "What's up?" "You know what? This thing with Alex? It ends now. He's not interested, Liza. Back off," I stated bluntly, my tone broking no argument. Liza's face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, come on, Ella. What's the harm in a little fun? Alex doesn't seem to mind." That was the last straw. I couldn't have her in my apartment any longer. "Pack your stuff. You need to leave. First thing tomorrow," I said firmly. Liza looked stunned, finally realizing I was serious. "You can't kick me out. Where will I go?" "That's not my problem. You should have thought of that before," I replied, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. It hurt, but it was necessary. The next morning, Liza left. She was out of my life again, and this time I hoped it was for good. As she walked out the door, her parting shot was, "You'll regret this, Ella. I promise you that." As the wedding day approached, the air was thick with excitement and a bit of last-minute chaos. Alex's mom, Janet, who used a wheelchair, had become more like family to me. We'd spent countless afternoons together, chatting and planning the wedding. "I always hoped Alex would find someone who cares as much as you do, Ella. You're a blessing to us," Janet would often say with a warm smile, making me feel all the more welcomed and loved in this new family. The day of the wedding rehearsal finally came, and our close friends and relatives gathered at the venue. Everyone was buzzing with happiness, everyone except for one, Liza. When she arrived, wearing a dress that was way too revealing for a family gathering, I felt my stomach churn. She sauntered around Alex, laughing too loudly at his jokes, touching his arm every chance she got. My heart pounded with annoyance, and I could feel Alex's discomfort. "I need a minute," I muttered to Alex and pulled him aside, out of earshot from the others. "I can't stand watching her hang all over you. It's disrespectful, and it's supposed to be our special day." Alex took my hands in his expression softening. "Hey, look at me. Nothing she does changes how I feel about you. Okay? She's background noise, that's all." I nodded, trying to calm down, when Liza's laughter echoed across the room, slicing through the chatter like a knife. I snapped. Striding over to where Liza was standing, I fixed her with a glare that I hoped would melt steel. "Liza, you need to leave. Now," I said, my voice louder than intended, drawing a few curious glances from the guests. Liza's eyes widened, but she didn't make a scene. Instead, she scoffed, flipped her hair over her shoulder, and walked out without another word. Relief washed over me as I watched her leave. Turning back to the gathering, I caught my mom's eye. She approached, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What was that all about?" Mom asked, her voice low. "I don't want her here, Mom. Not today, not at the wedding. She's done enough damage," I said, my voice firm. Mom nodded, her eyes softening. "I understand, honey. And well, there's something you should know about George. He and I are divorced. He turned out to be much worse than we thought, especially after the drinking got bad. He's not just out of my life, he's out of ours completely." My mind reeled. "And Liza? She's on her own now. George had a stroke and can barely manage, she's looking after him. They're not our concern anymore, Ella," Mom added, almost as if she were convincing herself too. The drama was behind us, and all that was left was to look forward to the beginning of a new chapter with Alex, free from the shadows of the past. The first year of marriage had flown by, seemingly perfect, with me setting up a small space in our apartment to continue my nail business. It was an ideal setup. I could work while still being there for Janet, my mother-in-law, who needed daily care due to her disability. Things seemed to be going well, until I started noticing a change in Alex. He began working late more often and his business trips became more frequent. At first, I thought it was just the strain of new responsibilities at work, but then I began to feel the distance between us growing. And my worries only deepened the day I overheard Janet talking on the phone while I was setting up my tools for a client. "Yes, my dear, I'm so excited. A grandson will be such a joy," she chuckled into the receiver. I paused, my heart skipping a beat. I was definitely not pregnant. Something didn't add up. After her call, I approached her, trying to sound casual. "Janet, who's having a grandson? Did I hear you right?" She looked up, startled, then flushed a deep red. "Oh, just messing with my old friend, dear. You know, making her jealous." It sounded off. Way off. My gut twisted with suspicion, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. One of my regular clients, Maria, who used to work as a PI, still had all her contacts. "Maria, I need to find out what's going on. Can you help me?" I asked during her appointment. "Of course, Ella. Give me a few days. I'll dig around and see what I can find," she assured me, her tone serious and professional. It didn't take long for Maria to get back to me with news that felt like a punch to the gut. Alex was having an affair. And not just with anyone, with Liza. She was pregnant. I felt a cold calm settle over me as I processed the betrayal. I didn't confront Alex. Instead, I waited, gathering my strength for what came next. The opportunity presented itself when Alex walked through the door with a set of divorce papers in his hand. "Ella, I'm sorry, but this just isn't working. I've met someone else," he said bluntly, his eyes not meeting mine. "Oh? And who might that be, Alex?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "It's Liza. She's expecting my child." "She's exciting, Ella." You've just become too predictable, too dull," he admitted coldly. "Pack your stuff." I signed the papers then and there, handing them back to him with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Before I go, Alex, just one last thing." He looked at me, confused. "What?" "Liza will be bringing her father with her." "Did she tell you that?" "He had a stroke and can't take care of himself. And he's got debts, massive ones, from the divorce settlement with my mother." "Good luck handling that," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth but necessary. Alex's face paled. "What? No, she didn't mention any. And there's more. I've filed a lawsuit for adultery. With proof. You'll be hearing from my lawyer," I continued, cutting him off. As I walked out, the cool air hit my face, and I felt a sense of freedom. The pain of betrayal still stung, but I knew I was moving towards something better. Something that was truly meant for me. After the dust settled from the divorce, the settlement from Alex and Liza was substantial enough that I could finally open my own nail salon, a dream I had shelved in the quieter corners of my mind for too long. The grand opening of Ella's Elegance was a hit. The local newspaper even covered the event, and the community support was overwhelming. I hired a few skilled technicians, and we quickly became a favorite in town for our meticulous work and calming atmosphere. One quiet afternoon, while I was sorting through some inventory in the back, my mom called. I always looked forward to our talks. They were the little moments of peace in my often hectic days. "Hi, Mom, what's up?" I asked, smiling as I paused to sit down. "Oh, nothing much. I just heard from an old friend of mine. Liza had her baby," she said hesitantly, probably expecting me to react negatively. Instead, I found myself smiling, genuinely hoping that child brought her more joy than she had brought to others. "That's good to hear, Mom. I hope they're both healthy. Speaking of which, I've got a little surprise for Alex that I think will close this chapter of my life for good." A couple of days later, I received a call from Alex that I had been half expecting, half dreading. He sounded desperate and defeated, a far cry from the competent man who had handed me divorce papers. "Ella, I received the documents from you," he started, his voice shaky. I can't believe it. Liza's child. I'm not the father?" His voice cracked with the question. "You're not surprised? You shouldn't be. You know what kind of person she is," I replied, my words deliberate and cold. There was a heavy silence before he continued. Ella, she's gone. I kicked her and her father out. It's been hell. Can we forget all this? Start over? I need you, Ella, he pleaded. The words might have tugged at my heartstrings once, but that time was long gone. Alex, you don't need me. You need a caretaker and a way to pay your debts. I'm not falling for that again. Take care of yourself, I said firmly before hanging up the phone. Sitting back in my chair, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The last tie to a painful past had been cut, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe freely. Life's been a series of tough breaks and lucky strikes. Losing my parents early stung like hell, but I got lucky when the elderly couple next door, the Parkers, took me in. They were the kindest souls you could imagine, treating me more like a granddaughter than a charity case. We weren't rich in money, but we were wealthy in love, and that's what mattered. Then, just as I was coming into my own, turning 18 and thinking about college, they died in a car accident. Just like that, I was on my own again. The Parkers left me a bit of money for school and their old house in the suburbs. It was a cozy place, full of memories, but too many ghosts for me. So, I sold it and bought a small apartment in the city near the college where I'd enrolled to study financial management. It felt good, having a plan, moving forward. Classes were tough but interesting, and I threw myself into learning everything about numbers and markets. After college, I landed a decent job. Daytimes were packed with work, and I was doing all right, but nights were another story. The city felt lonelier than it should for a place so full. That's when I met Tom at a friend's party. He was loud, funny, and didn't care who knew it. His energy was infectious, and we hit it off from the moment he bumped into me, spilling my drink. "Hey, watch it." I snapped, more out of surprise than anger. "Whoa, my bad. Let me make it up to you. What were you drinking?" Tom grinned, unapologetically charming. "Beer, just beer," I said, trying not to smile too easily. "2 beers coming right up," he shouted over the music, heading to the makeshift bar. That was Tom all over, simple, straightforward, and no fuss. We spent the whole night talking about everything and nothing. It turned out we both loved old movies and hated sushi. It was easy, talking to him, and by the time the party was winding down, I didn't want to say goodbye. A year later, he proposed. No dramatic gestures, just him, me, and a ring he fumbled out of his pocket while we were watching TV. "Marry me," he told, holding the ring so tightly I thought he might crush it. I laughed. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so typical of us, so perfectly imperfect. "Yes, of course, you big goof." Getting married didn't change much at first. We were the same, just legally bound, which felt right. We settled into life together in my small city apartment, still close to the hustle, but now with someone to share the quiet moments. Life felt full, and for the first time in a long while, the evenings didn't feel so empty. Settling into married life had its comforts, but life sure doesn't let you get too cozy without throwing a curveball or two. Jake's folks, Mr. and Mrs. Harper, were gems. Living in their cozy suburban home, they welcomed me with open arms from the get-go. I could see where Jake got his easygoing nature. Their warmth was a balm on my oftentimes still sore heart, still aching from my own family losses. "So happy you're part of our family now," Mrs. Harper would often say, squeezing my hand with a kindness that felt both uplifting and overwhelming. "Thanks, I really appreciate how welcoming you've been," I'd reply, feeling genuinely grateful. Visiting them became our weekend ritual. Those days were filled with backyard barbecues and lengthy chats over cups of steaming coffee. Life was good, simple, and honest, until it wasn't. Jake got called away on a long business trip, a whole year out of state. It was a fantastic opportunity for his career, but the timing was brutal. No sooner had Jake left than Mr. Harper's health took a nosedive. It happened fast, and Mrs. Harper, bless her heart, sounded near out of her mind with worry when she called. Kimberly, I hate to ask, but I could really use your help around here. George is really not doing well. Her voice was thick with unshed tears. Without a second thought, I packed a bag and headed to the suburbs. Seeing Mr. Harper so frail shook me. He had always been a pillar, strong and steady. Now, he looked shrunken, tethered to his life through a maze of medical tubes. I slipped into the routine of their household seamlessly, handling the cooking and cleaning while Mrs. Harper focused on George's care. Evenings I spent sitting by Mr. Harper's side, reading out loud his favorite classics, his eyes often fluttering closed long before I finished a chapter. "Thank you, Kimberly," he'd whisper on good days, his voice a shadow of his former robust tone. "It's my pleasure, really," I'd squeeze his hand, trying to offer comfort through simple touch. One quiet afternoon, Mrs. Harper sat down at the kitchen table while I was chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked worn, older than her years. "Kimberly, I don't know how to say this, but we're in a bit of a bind," she began, wringing her hands nervously. "George was the main earner, you know, and with him like this." I put down the knife, giving her my full attention. "We're strapped, honey. I hate to even ask, but could you consider renting out your apartment? It might help us get through this tough spot." She looked down, clearly embarrassed. I didn't even hesitate. "Of course, Mrs. Harper. I'll get on it right away," I said firmly, trying to ease her burden. The apartment rented out quickly, and every month, I dutifully transferred the rental income to Mrs. Harper, along with money for groceries and whatever bills piled up. It wasn't easy. The commute to my job in the city became a nightmare. But family sticks together, right? That's what I kept telling myself, even on the hardest days. "Kimberly, you're a godsend," Mrs. Harper would often say, her relief palpable each time I handed her the money. "It's what family does," I'd respond, though some nights, as I lay in the guest room listening to the distant sounds of sirens from the city, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. Jake's calls were my only respite, his voice a tether to another life. "How's it going, Kim? You holding up okay?" His concern was always evident, even through the static of long-distance calls. "We're managing. Don't worry about us." I'd force cheerfulness into my voice, not wanting to add to his stress. Life in the Harper household took a drastic turn when Susan, Mrs. Harper's daughter from her first marriage, showed up unexpectedly. The vibe shifted immediately. She had that kind of presence, like a cold breeze that sneaks under the door. I never really knew Susan well, but I'd heard enough from Jake and even glimpsed her frosty relationship with Mr. Harper during brief, tense visits. My days had already stretched thin, juggling long commutes to work and caring for Mr. Harper, who was now bedridden and fading fast. Susan's arrival, however, added a whole new layer of tension. It was clear she was here to stay, making herself at home as if she owned the place. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Mr. Harper beckoned me to his side with a weak gesture. His voice was a hoarse whisper, strained and urgent. "Kimberly, you need to watch out for Susan. She's a very bad person." I leaned closer, the gravity in his tone pulling a knot tight in my stomach. "I understand, Mr. Harper. I'll be careful," I promised, though I wasn't exactly sure what I was promising against. True to Mr. Harper's warning, Susan wasted no time establishing her new regime. The first sign was when I found her in the kitchen one morning, her presence like a storm cloud over the breakfast nook. "Just so we're clear, I'm not here to play housemaid or chef for anyone," she declared, her tone sharp as she sipped her coffee, eyeing me like I was an intruder in her mother's kitchen. I was taken aback, but managed to keep my cool. "Okay, Susan. I've been handling things so far, and I can keep at it," I said, trying to keep the peace. "Good, because I don't plan on lifting a finger. This is Mom's house, after all," she snapped back, her eyes daring me to challenge her. From that day on, Susan made sure her presence was felt and not in a good way. She'd order takeout just for herself and her mother, leaving their empty boxes on the table for me to clean up. Her disdain wasn't subtle, and it stung, but I swallowed the bitterness, because Mr. Harper needed peace. "Kimberly, why don't you sit and eat with us tonight?" Mrs. Harper asked one evening, a rare moment of old warmth in her voice. Before I could respond, Susan cut in sharply. "Mom, Kimberly's been busy all day, she probably prefers eating later." Her words were coated with fake concern, but the message was clear: I wasn't welcome. The days grew heavier, my chores doubling as Susan's entitlement filled every corner of the house. I'd hear her late at night, whispering with her mother, turning her against me with poison words. Mrs. Harper, once so kind and understanding, started to change too, her looks colder, her thank yous fewer. A couple of weeks later, Mr. Harper was gone. The funeral was a solemn affair, with Jake flying in just in time to say his goodbyes. It was the first time in months we were together, and the relief of having him by my side was palpable. Yet, amidst the mourning, I noticed the air had shifted significantly at the Harper residence. Susan was on her best behavior, treating everyone with a forced politeness. "How's everything been while I've been gone?" Jake asked me quietly during a brief moment we had alone after the service. "Fine, everything's been fine," I lied, forcing a smile. I didn't want to burden him further, his grief was enough to handle. "You sure? You look a bit worn out," he pressed, his brow furrowed with concern. "It's just been busy, you know, helping out around here," I reassured him, avoiding his gaze. It wasn't the time to delve into the mess that was brewing beneath the surface. As soon as Jake left, Susan dropped her act. The mask of the dutiful sister was gone, replaced by the sneering, dismissive attitude I'd grown accustomed to. The dynamic in the house shifted drastically. Mrs. Harper, perhaps in her own throbbing grief, became distant and cold towards me. Commands replaced conversations, and I felt more like an intruder than a family member. Susan took over the household like she was the lady of the manor. Her reign was marked by disregard for anyone's feelings but her own. She started barging into my room without knocking, rummaging through my things as though she was searching for buried treasure. One afternoon, I was out in the garden trying to find some peace, when I stumbled upon a box lying among the shrubs. Curiosity piqued, I opened it, only to find my watches, jewelry, and even some underwear. My heart sank. Nearby, draped carelessly over a bush, were several of my dresses. Fury bubbled up inside me as I gathered my belongings. Clutching the box, I stormed inside, finding Susan in the living room, lounging like she owned the place. "What the hell, Susan?" I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. "You can't just throw my stuff out." Susan laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed mockingly around the room. "Live here? Please, you're just a guest, and not a welcome one. You should be out in the garden, or better yet, on the street. You're nothing but a rootless beggar anyway." Her words stung like salt in a wound. I couldn't believe the venom in her voice. Trembling, I turned to Mrs. Harper, who had just entered the room. "Mrs. Harper, please, tell her she can't treat me like this. This is supposed to be my home too," I pleaded, my voice cracking. Mrs. Harper, once kind and gentle, now looked through me as if I were glass. "This is Susan's house now." "She's right, Kimberly. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to live." Her words were a blow I hadn't anticipated. I stood there, the box in my hands, my heart breaking in my chest. The home I had come to know, the family I thought I had, crumbled around me in that instant. Despite everything, I stayed because of a promise I made to Mr. Harper on his deathbed, to look after his wife and not let Susan overpower her. But day by day, Mrs. Harper seemed to adopt Susan's cruel traits, her words turning sharp, her eyes cold. "You're just sitting on your hands here, aren't you?" Mrs. Harper snapped one evening as I cleaned up after dinner, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm doing my best to keep things running smoothly," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the hurt her words caused. "Best? Could have fooled me. Seems like you're just freeloading," she scoffed, turning her back to me as she left the room. Her words stung. I was far from a freeloader. I had rented out my apartment and transferred nearly all that income to Mrs. Harper, on top of handling most of the housework, while Susan did nothing but criticize. Susan, living off her mother's pension, was relentless. Really, what did my brother even see in you? She would taunt me nightly, her voice loud enough to carry through the thin walls. I'd bite my tongue, swallow the anger and frustration, and remind myself of the promise I made. But the atmosphere was suffocating, the house a minefield of hostility. One evening, coming home early from work, my world tilted on its axis. I walked in to hear Susan and Mrs. Harper in the middle of a heated discussion in the living room, not noticing my arrival. "We need to get her to sell that apartment of hers. You know how much we could use that money," Susan was saying, her tone greedy and calculating. "Yes, but how do we convince her? Kimberly's no fool, she won't just hand it over," Mrs. Harper replied, her voice a mix of frustration and greed. "Leave it to me, Mom. I'll sweet-talk her into it. Once she signs it over, we can finally live the way we deserve." Susan's words slithered through the air like a snake. Hearing them plot to strip me of my only financial security was a cold splash of reality. Fear gripped me. I couldn't stay, not anymore. My heart pounding, I slipped away to my room unnoticed. They were planning to rob me of everything. The decision was made right then, there was no staying after this. I hurriedly packed my essentials, my hands shaking. Every second in that house now felt like a countdown to disaster. I didn't bother with goodbyes, they didn't deserve them. Slipping out the back door, I ordered a taxi to the station. Sitting on the train to Jake's state, doubts swirled in my mind. Would Jake understand? Would he take their side? The uncertainty was crushing, but the fear of what might happen if I stayed was worse. I stared out the window, watching the landscape blur by, a mix of fear and resolve settling in my chest. When I arrived at Jake's place, his reaction was a cocktail of shock, relief, and a swirl of questions. His eyes widened as he opened the door to find me standing there, bag in hand, looking probably as frazzled as I felt. "Kimberly? What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. I hesitated, taking in the familiar, comforting sight of his temporary home. "No, Jake, everything's not okay. Not at all," I replied, my voice catching a bit. He led me to the couch, his expression now lined with worry. "Talk to me, babe. What happened?" I told him everything, starting from Susan's return, the worsening conditions at home, the financial manipulations, and the final straw, the plot to make me sell my apartment. I hadn't wanted to worry him before, didn't want to add to his stress while he was away working. Jake's face darkened with each word I spoke. By the time I finished, his fists were clenched, his jaw set hard. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and concern. "I didn't want to cause more trouble. I thought I could handle it," I admitted, feeling foolish now. "Kimberly, damn it, you shouldn't have to handle anything like that alone," he exploded, standing up to pace the room. "I can't believe my mom and Susan would treat you this way." He stopped and looked at me, his eyes intense. "I'm not letting anyone treat my wife like that. No way," he declared, pulling out his phone. I watched, heart pounding, as he dialed his mother. The phone barely rang twice before she picked up. I couldn't hear her words, but the stiffness in Jake's shoulders told me enough. "Mom, this has to stop. I know about everything, and I won't tolerate it. If Susan doesn't leave, and if you don't start treating Kimberly with respect, you can forget about us helping out anymore. No more money, no more nothing." Jake's voice was steel, not giving room for any argument. There was a brief, fiery exchange, then silence. Jake's hand tightened around the phone. "Fine, if that's your choice, then you've made mine," he said finally, and hung up. He turned to look at me, his expression softening. "Looks like it's just us now, babe. That's all we need," he said, coming over to wrap me in his arms. I leaned into him, the safety of his embrace fortifying me against the whirlwind of emotions. "Just us," I murmured, feeling the truth of his words. We were on our own now, but somehow, that felt okay. Jake and I talked long into the night. We discussed practical things like my remote work arrangements and our financial plans without the extra drain of supporting his mother and Susan. It felt like we were laying the foundations for a new chapter, just the two of us. Whatever happens, we're in this together. You and me against the world, right? Jake said with a determined grin. Right, I smiled back, feeling more confident with him by my side. Against the world. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I contacted my job to arrange remote work, which thankfully, they agreed to. Jake helped me move my things from storage and set up a home office in the corner of his living room. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it was peaceful. A week into our newfound peace, I was jolted by a call that almost felt like a ghost from a past life. It was Mrs. Harper. Her voice, once sweet to me, now dripped with a mix of desperation and audacity. Kimberly, why haven't I received the money for this month? You know we depend on it, she demanded right off the bat. I was stunned silent for a moment, her nerve unbelievable. I'm sorry, but after everything, you really expect me to continue supporting you? I asked, my tone more incredulous than angry. In the background, I could hear Susan's voice, shrill and angry. She's just an ungrateful girl, Mom. Make her transfer the money. Taking a deep breath to calm my rising anger, I remembered the venomous words they had thrown at me, words that stung deep. Mrs. Harper, Susan called me a rootless beggar, remember? I'm not sending money to people who treat me like trash. I'm done. There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost picture Mrs. Harper's shocked face. But we're family, she finally said, her voice a mixture of anger and pleading. No, family doesn't treat each other that way. Goodbye, Mrs. Harper, I said firmly and hung up before she could respond. The call shook me, but Jake was right there, his support unwavering. You did the right thing, Kimberly. It's time they learn to stand on their own, he reassured me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. Not long after settling back into our hometown, another surprise came our way. I was pregnant. The news brought a joy we hadn't expected, and suddenly, the future seemed filled with possibilities. We decided it was time to sell my apartment and buy a small house in the suburbs, a place near a good school where our child could grow up. As we were planning our move, another call came, and again from Mrs. Harper. Her tone was different this time, desperate, almost pitiful. Kimberly, I've made a mistake. Susan forced me to sell the house, took the money, and left me with nothing. Could I come and live with you and Jake? Her voice was shaky, pleading. The request stunned me. After everything, this was a test of my resolve. Mrs. Harper, you chose this path when you sided with Susan against us. You could have chosen differently, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I know I've made mistakes, but you have a kind heart. Can't you forgive an old woman for her wrong choices? She implored. I sighed, feeling a pang of pity, but remembering the pain her choices had caused. I forgave you long ago, but that doesn't mean I can let you back into my life. You need to live with the consequences of your actions, just as I have, I replied and ended the call. Then, with a resolute tap, I blocked her number. We moved forward with our plans, purchasing a quaint house with a little garden where our child could play. It was a lazy Sunday morning, the kind where you linger over coffee and the newspaper. I was flipping through the pages when a headline caught my eye, local woman arrested for massive fraud scheme. There, staring back at me from the paper, was Susan, handcuffed and looking defeated. I couldn't help the mix of shock and, admittedly, a slight vindication that washed over me. Look at this, Jake, I called out, holding up the newspaper for him to see. It's Susan. She's been arrested for fraud. Jake took the newspaper, scanning the article with a serious expression. Wow, can't say I'm surprised, but still, it's a lot to take in. Yeah, it is. But she made her choices, and now she's facing the consequences, I replied, feeling a closure I hadn't realized I needed. The news eventually drifted to us through friends that Mrs. Harper was living in a tiny apartment, working 2 jobs to scrape by. Her pension wasn't enough to cover her living expenses and pay off the debts Susan had left her with. Did you hear about your mom? One of Jake's friends, Matt, brought it up one evening when they were over for a backyard barbecue. Yeah, I heard, Jake responded, flipping burgers on the grill. His voice held a trace of sadness, but it was tempered with resolve. She chose her path, Matt. It's tough, but that's how it is. Matt nodded, understanding the unspoken boundaries. You're right, man. Just thought you should know. The conversation shifted after that, the evening air filled with the lighter topics of sports and work. Life had moved on, and so had we. The joy of our new life really crystallized when Mia came into the world. Becoming parents changed everything. It shifted our priorities, our dreams, and even healed some of the old wounds by filling them with new love. Can you believe she's ours? I whispered to Jake one night as we watched Mia sleeping peacefully in her crib. She's perfect, Kimberly. Just perfect, Jake murmured back, his voice thick with emotion. We spent our days marveling at each little milestone Mia achieved, each smile, each giggle. She was our little miracle, and with her, the hardships of the past seemed to recede, making room for new memories, better ones. Each day was simple, but filled with little moments of joy that stitched a tapestry of a happy family life. I came into this world not with a cheer, but a burden. My mother, Elizabeth, wasn't ready for me, or maybe she just never wanted to be. It's hard to tell the difference when you're the unwanted one. From my first breath, I was more a problem than a person in her eyes. You never stop crying, do you? She would hiss during those long nights of my infancy. Her voice was often laced with irritation, lacking the gentle touch you'd expect from a mother. My father, Michael, was different. He was the one who stepped up, trading sleep for soothing walks with me in his arms, while my mother locked herself away in silence. Let me take her, Liz, I remember him pleading one night, his voice as soft as the blankets he wrapped me in. You need to rest. As I grew, the gap between my mother's affection and indifference widened, especially when Emily was born. Suddenly, there was light in my mother's eyes, but it wasn't for me. Look at her, Michael. She's perfect, Mom cooed over Emily, something I never heard directed at me. The differences were stark. While Emily slept quietly in her arms, I was often left playing alone or trying to help around the house. Why don't you be a good big sister and play quietly? Emily is sleeping. Mom would often chide when my footsteps or small voice crept a decibel too high. My role in the house grew as I got older. I wasn't just the elder sister, I was the helper, the cook, the cleaner, whatever kept me busy and out of the way. As time went on, I learned the art of invisibility at home. It was easier to blend into the background, to anticipate needs before they were spoken. By the time high school rolled around, I was more the family caretaker than their child. Anna, make sure the laundry's done and dinner's ready by 6, Mom would command as she left with Emily for another shopping trip, their laughter a bitter sound as it faded down the hallway. Yes, Mom, was always my reply, mechanical, rehearsed. At school, things were different. I was a good student, quiet but diligent. Teachers noticed me, praised me, something that never happened at home. They encouraged me, talked about potential and futures that seemed so distant from my reality. Have you thought about college, Anna? Mr. Henderson, my English teacher, once asked. His encouragement felt like a lifeline. I'd like to, sir. I really would. I admitted, a flicker of hope stirring within. Those moments, rare and precious, were what fueled me. They made the long days and lonely nights bearable. They whispered of a life beyond the confines of my mother's cold indifference and the shadow of my sister's favored existence. A life where maybe, just maybe, I could be seen for who I was, not just for what I could do for others. By the time I graduated high school, I had my plan all mapped out. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple escape from a home that felt more like a prison. The day I turned 18, I packed my bags, mostly filled with second-hand clothes and a few cherished books. You really going through with this? Dad asked, his face lined with worry as he watched me stuff a duffel bag. Your mom's gonna flip, you know. She expects you to stick around, help out with the house, with Emily. I zipped up the bag with more force than necessary. I know, but I can't stay here, Dad. I gotta try and make something of myself. I moved into a tiny apartment on the edge of town, close enough to my new job at a local diner. The work was hard and the hours were long, but every paycheck was a step closer to my goal. The diner was a noisy, bustling place, filled with the clatter of dishes and the constant chatter of customers. I learned to keep my head down and my hands busy. Nights were spent in a cramped study corner of my apartment, textbooks spread out as I worked through community college applications. I was determined to be more than a waitress, more than what my mother said I'd be. "Why you both errand with all that school stuff?" my neighbor, Jo, once asked when she caught me buried in paperwork. "Ain't like it's gonna change much." "It might not," I admitted, "but it's worth a shot. I want to be a teacher, Jo. I want to do something meaningful." Jo snorted, dragging on her cigarette. "Well, good luck with that, kid. This world ain't kind to dreamers." Saving money became a game of numbers. Every tip went into a jar, every spare dollar tucked away for future tuition. I cut corners everywhere, lived on ramen and toast, and kept my eyes on the prize. After a year of relentless work and study, I had enough to enroll in college. I chose the local community college, affordable and within commuting distance. The day I received my acceptance letter, I felt a surge of pride like never before. Walking into my first class, I felt out of place with my worn-out jeans and second-hand textbooks, but I was there, in a seat, ready to learn. "You here for the early childhood education program?" a girl next to me asked, her pen tapping nervously on her notebook. "I'm Sarah. We should study together, maybe?" "Sure, Sarah. I'm Anna. I'd like that." College was a whole new world, one where I wasn't just the forgotten daughter or the hard-working waitress. I was a student, a peer, and soon, I found myself part of a community. Evenings were still spent at the diner, but now my days were filled with lectures, group projects, and a growing belief that I could really make this happen. I could become someone who made a difference. The path wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of fear that maybe Jo was right, that maybe the world wasn't kind to dreamers. But every time I helped a classmate understand a tough concept, or received praise from a professor, I knew I was where I was supposed to be. By the time my second year of college rolled around, I was deep into my studies and working the evening shift at the diner. One evening, as I balanced a tray full of burgers and shakes, my phone buzzed in my apron. It was an email from the college financial office. My heart skipped. This was it, the scholarship decision. I waited until my break, hands shaking as I logged in to read the email. "Congratulations," it began. "We are pleased to inform you." I didn't need to read the rest, I had done it. A full ride for the next year. I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding and slid down against the wall, relief washing over me. The following weeks flew by in a blur of exams and late-night shifts. But with my financial worries eased, I was able to focus more on what I really loved, learning how to teach. As the semester ended, I started applying for teaching positions, each application sent with a mix of hope and nerves. One afternoon, while I was setting up for a job fair, my old classmate, Sarah, bumped into me. "Listen, are you still looking for a job? My aunt's school is looking for a new primary teacher. You should totally apply." I followed up on Sarah's tip and landed an interview. The night before, I practiced answers to possible questions in front of my mirror, determined to come off as confident and competent. The principal, Mr. Davis, was a stern-looking man who softened a bit as we talked. "Why do you want to work with children?" he asked, peering at me over his glasses. "Because I believe every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists they become the best they can possibly be." I walked out of there feeling like I had just won my second scholarship. A week later, I got the call. I was in. I was going to be a teacher. After years of working tirelessly as a teacher and constantly hitting the books at night to stay ahead, I decided it was high time to invest in a proper laptop. Walking into the tech store, I was more than a little out of my element. Rows of shiny, high-tech gadgets lined the walls, each one promising the world. I must have looked lost because a guy with a friendly smile and a name tag that read Tom approached me. Need some help finding something? He asked, his tone friendly. Yeah, I'm looking for a laptop that can handle a lot of multitasking and won't give up on me in a year, I replied, hoping I sounded like I knew what I was talking about. Tom nodded, showing me a few models and explaining the specs in a way that didn't go right over my head. This one here would be perfect for what you need, and it's within budget. As he rang up the sale, he gave a casual, "You know, you seem really into your work. If you ever need tech advice, or any advice, really, here's my number." We started texting, casual at first, then daily. Dates followed, easy nights out where the laughter flowed as freely as the conversation. But whenever things edged toward serious, Tom was quick with the brakes. "We're still young, Anna. There's no rush," he'd say, every time I hinted at something deeper. I didn't push it. I was busy enough, and having someone even just to laugh with felt like a win. But then, one lazy Saturday morning, as I was enjoying my coffee and the rare chance to sleep in, my phone rang. It was Mom, which was unusual enough to spike my heartbeat. "Anna, it's your dad. He's really sick. You should come." The weight in her voice pulled me upright. "I'm on my way." Tom, sprawled on the couch, sat up. "Everything okay?" "It's my dad. I have to go see him. He's sick." "I'll come with you," he offered, and something in his tone made it clear he wasn't asking. We drove in silence, the tension thick. As we pulled up to the family house, his whistle cut through the quiet. "Damn, Anna, you didn't say you grew up in a mansion." "It's not as glamorous as it looks," I murmured, my stomach knotting up as we walked to the door. Inside, Mom and Emily were the picture of superficial concern. I introduced Tom, their smiles a little too polished. "Nice to finally meet the man making our Anna so happy," Mom cooed, her eyes appraising. "We were just talking about the future," Emily chimed in, eyeing Tom like a new accessory she might like to try. I barely listened, my focus on getting to Dad. He was propped up in bed, looking so frail it knocked the breath from me. "Anna, my girl," he rasped as I approached. "I'm sorry for everything." Tears stung my eyes, but I managed to smile. "It's okay, Dad. I'm here now." "I should have been stronger. Should have stood up for you more," he continued, each word labored. We talked a little more until he drifted off, tired from the effort. I kissed his forehead and joined the others at dinner, Tom in tow. The conversation at the table turned quickly to money, inheritances, things that seemed so trivial with Dad's room just upstairs. "Your father's made some smart investments," Mom was saying, her voice light, almost excited. "It should keep us comfortable." "Yeah, I've been looking at trips to Europe," Emily added, like she was picking out items from a catalog. Tom listened, nodding along, but I felt sick. "Shouldn't we focus on Dad's health first?" I interjected, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "Oh, Anna, always so dramatic," Emily sighed. "We have to be practical about the future." I wanted to argue, to scream that they were talking about Dad like he was already gone. But I bit my tongue, the words tasting like bile. We drove back to my place, the city lights blurring past as I let the distance from that house, from those people, slowly help me breathe easier. Coming back from that unsettling dinner at my parents' place, Tom seemed more contemplative than usual. We'd barely closed the door to my apartment when he turned to me, his expression serious. "Anna, I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, running a hand through his hair. "Marry me, Anna." The proposal was as unexpected as a thunderclap in clear skies. "What? Tom, where is this coming from?" "I know it's sudden," he admitted, stepping closer. "But today, seeing everything. I just know I want to be there for you, for good. We don't need anything big, just us, together." His words, sincere and raw, cut through the confusion. I loved him, that much was clear. And maybe, just maybe, he was the solid thing I could hold on to. "Okay, yes," I said, the decision feeling right despite the chaos of my thoughts. We didn't wait. The very next week, we stood together at City Hall, exchanging simple vows in a quiet room. No frills, no grand speeches, just a promise to each other. But even the warmth of new marriage couldn't shield me from the concern for my father. His health was deteriorating, each visit painting a starker picture than the last. One afternoon, as I sat beside his bed, holding his hand while he dozed, he stirred and looked at me with a clarity that had become rare. "Anna," he murmured, squeezing my hand. "When I'm gone, there'll be something for you. A surprise." I brushed his hair back from his forehead, smiling to ease his worries. "Dad, don't talk like that. You need to focus on getting better." But he shook his head gently. "Just know that I did what I could." His words hung between us, heavy and somber. I chose not to press him, thinking it was the illness speaking, his mind fogged by medication and pain. Leaving his room that day felt harder than ever. At home, Tom tried to comfort me, but the image of my father's frail form haunted me. Meanwhile, Mom and Emily's conversations about the future grew more frequent and filled with cold calculations. One evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen while I was supposed to be out. "The medical bills are piling up, and with your father like this, well, it's not sustainable," Mom was saying, her voice laced with impatience. "I've already signed up for plastic surgery to find a new boyfriend." Emily responded, her tone just as calculating. "We need to think about what comes next. I want that new car that you and I saw in the salon." Frustrated and heartbroken, I left them to their scheming. Back at my place, Tom held me close as I cried, my tears for my father, for the family I wished I had. The day we buried my father was cold and gray, the sky mourning with us as friends and relatives came to pay their respects. That evening, the family gathered at my parents' house. The air was thick with tension, everyone too aware of the elephant in the room, the inheritance. I was emotionally drained and wanted nothing more than to honor my father's memory in peace, but that wasn't to be. Tom was the first to break the silence about the will. "So, what's going to happen now with the inheritance? We need to know what we're dealing with here," he said, his tone a bit too casual for the occasion. I shot him a look, my heart sinking. "Tom, can we not do this right now? Today isn't about money." But he pressed on, oblivious or indifferent to my discomfort. "I'm just saying, it's important. I mean, shouldn't the house go to Anna? It's only fair." My mother, who had been quietly listening, laughed dryly. "Fair? This house has always belonged to Emily and me. You two were just passing through." Tom's face hardened, and he turned to my sister. "Emily, you know this isn't right. Anna deserves her share." Emily, looking more interested than she had all evening, fluttered her eyelashes at Tom. "Oh, Tom, you always think of others." But Mom's right, as usual. The conversation spiraled, voices raised in a bitter symphony. I felt sick listening to them, the words melding into a cacophony of greed. How could a day of mourning turn so quickly into a scramble for wealth? As they argued, Tom's attitude shifted, his earlier support for me fading as he began to compliment Emily on her sensible outlook. Watching him sidle up to my sister, something in me snapped. I couldn't stomach another minute of it. I fled to my father's room, the one place that still held traces of his presence, and collapsed into a restless sleep. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of coffee and found Tom in the kitchen. His expression was grave, a stark contrast to the light banter of just days before. "Anna, we need to talk," he began, avoiding my gaze. "I'm in love with Emily. I think she and I have a future together." The room spun a little, his declaration landing like a physical blow. "You're what? Tom, are you serious?" Before he could answer, I called Emily and Mom to join us. Emily came down, looking smug, while Mom watched with a curious eye. "I just wanted you to hear it from me first," Emily said, her tone infuriatingly calm. "I'm a decent person, Anna. I didn't want to go behind your back." Mom nodded, her approval evident. "It's very noble of you, Emily, to be so upfront about this." Their words, their betrayal, it was too much. I felt a cold, hard calm settle over me. "You all deserve each other," I said quietly. Tom extended the divorce papers toward me, a pen poised. Without hesitation, I signed, each stroke of my name severing the ties that bound us. "You'll get your things through a courier. Don't come back." With that, I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and didn't look back. I was free now, and with that freedom, a new path lay open. A path I would walk alone, but at least it was mine, honest and unencumbered. 2 weeks later, we all got back together in the notary's sterile office, about to hear the reading of my father's will. The air was tense, thick with unspoken accusations and bitter expectations. Mom and Emily were chatting in hushed, anxious tones, while Tom looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat next to Emily. The notary, Mr. Clarkson, a severe-looking man with glasses perched on the tip of his nose, cleared his throat and began reading the will. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, bracing for whatever came next. "To my daughter Anna," Mr. Clarkson read, his voice neutral, "I leave the sum of $400,000. The room went silent for a heartbeat before chaos erupted. Mom's face turned a shade of red I knew too well as her financial desperation spilled out. "I have debts, Anna. Your father knew. He promised he'd take care of us," she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. Emily joined in, her voice sharp and accusing. "And what about me? I'm getting married to Tom. We need that money for a proper wedding." "You don't need all that money, Anna." I stared at them, the sheer audacity rendering me momentarily speechless. Tom, meanwhile, tried to play the affection card, stepping toward me with open arms. "I've missed you, Anna. I've made a mistake. I only ever loved you." Before he could reach me, Emily yanked him back by the shirt, her eyes wide with betrayal. "Tom, what are you doing?" He tried to wriggle free from her grasp, but Emily's grip was tight, her nails practically digging into his skin. "Enough," Mr. Clarkson's voice boomed through the room, louder than I'd ever heard. "If you cannot behave in a civilized manner, I will have to ask you to leave. And if necessary, I will call the police." The threat of authority seemed to pierce through the chaos, bringing a sudden, sullen silence to the room. Mom and Emily, with crocodile tears streaming down their faces, turned to me once more. "Anna, please," my mother begged, her voice softening to a manipulative whisper. "Think of your family." Emily, still clinging to Tom, echoed her plea. "We're your family, Anna. Don't we mean anything to you?" Looking at them, at their false tears and desperate faces, something inside me hardened. These were not the actions of a family, they were the actions of vultures dressed in familiar skins. "No," I said firmly, my voice steady, despite the shaking of my hands. "This money is what Dad wanted me to have. He knew I would use it wisely, not squander it on debts or lavish weddings." Tom, Emily, and Mom stared back, a mixture of shock and indignation written across their faces. "You'll regret this, Anna. You won't be happy with this money," Mom hissed as I turned to leave. "Maybe," I replied, pausing at the door. "But I'd rather find that out on my own, without any of you." As I stepped into the sunlight, the cool air felt like the first breath of a new life, one where I was no longer bound by the toxic ties of those who shared my blood but not my values. I used the money to open a small private kindergarten. It was something I'd dreamed of, a place where children could feel loved and valued, the way I wished I had felt growing up. The process wasn't easy. There were permits to obtain, a property to renovate, curriculums to design, and staff to hire. But every step felt right. I named it Bright Beginnings, a nod to the new start it represented for me and the children we would serve. Business was good, better than I had hoped. Parents loved our approach, and word of mouth spread. Soon, we were at full capacity, and I began planning an expansion. One day, while reviewing blueprints with my assistant, Jenny, my phone buzzed with an update from a name I hadn't seen in a while, Rachel, a mutual acquaintance of my family. "Hey Anna, thought you should know, your mom and Emily sold the house. They had to move out of town, ended up in a small place. Not much left after settling their debts," she texted. I stared at the screen for a long moment. "Thanks for the update, Rachel," I typed back, a mix of emotions swirling through me. As the days turned into weeks, Bright Beginnings grew not just in size, but in reputation. It was during this busy time that Tom reappeared, as unexpectedly as he had exited my life. I was returning from a meeting when I found him standing outside my apartment, a huge bouquet in his hands and that same charming smile plastered on his face. "Anna, hey, I've been thinking about you," he said as I approached, trying to hand me the flowers. I stopped short, my keys in my hand, an incredulous laugh escaping me. "Really, Tom? After everything, you think flowers will fix it? Come on, Anna. I made a mistake. Can we talk?" His voice was coaxing, his smile faltering just a bit. I looked at him, really looked at him, and all I saw was the same selfishness, the same opportunism. "No, Tom. We can't. There's nothing for you here." He lingered for a moment, the smile finally slipping off his face as he realized I was serious. Then, with nowhere left to push, he turned and left, the discarded flowers lying wilted by my doorstep. The next few months flew by. Bright Beginnings became not just a daycare, but a cornerstone of the community. We hosted family events, workshops for parents, and continued to expand our services. As I watched the children play in the newly added outdoor play area, their laughter ringing clear and true, I felt a sense of accomplishment and peace. I had built something lasting, something meaningful. My name's Tasha, and let me tell you about how my world used to be before everything flipped upside down. Back when life was just Dad, Mom, and me, we lived in a big old house with more rooms than I bothered to count. It was peaceful, you know, the kind of place where laughter filled the halls, and there was always some sweet smell wafting from the kitchen. Mom was the heart of our home. She'd wake up singing, her voice floating up the stairs. "Tasha, rise and shine, sweetheart." I'd drag myself out of bed, grumbling like any teenager would, but her bright smile over pancakes made it worth it. Dad, he was the cool one. Always had a joke ready to lighten the mood or a story about his younger days. "When I was your age, I thought I could conquer the world with just a guitar and a bad haircut," he'd say, and we'd laugh, knowing he'd done just fine with a business suit and a level head instead. Life was good. More than good, actually, it was perfect. But as they say, all good things have a way of ending too soon. When Mom got sick, it was like our little paradise started to crumble. I remember the day she told us. We were sitting in the living room, the TV was on but no one was watching. "I have some tough news," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying her fear. "Cancer." That word hit me like a ton of bricks. Dad reached for her hand, and they shared a look, a silent promise that they'd fight it together. The months that followed were rough. Hospitals, treatments, Mom losing her hair, but not her spirit. She'd joke about saving money on shampoo, trying to make it easier on us. But I saw the tears she thought she hid, heard the worry in Dad's whispers when he thought I was asleep. The day we lost her, everything changed. Dad and I, we tried to hold on to each other, to keep the pieces of our shattered family together. "We'll get through this, Tasha. We have to," Dad would say, his voice rough, the bags under his eyes getting darker each day. A year later, Dad brought someone new into our home. Victoria. She was like a whirlwind, sweeping in with her perfect hair and sharp clothes, taking over everything Mom had left behind. The first time I met her, she looked me up and down, a smirk playing on her lips as if she'd already figured me out. She walked around, touching Mom's things, rearranging the furniture. "George tells me you're quite the student. I'm sure you won't mind helping out more around here, now that I'm taking care of things." I remember feeling my fists clench at my sides. Help out? This was my home, not some boot camp she could run. But for Dad's sake, I bit my tongue. "Sure, I can do more." Dad seemed to shrink a bit more each day, his laughter not as loud, his stories not as frequent. He was trying, though, for the sake of what he called moving forward. I wasn't so convinced. The new house was twice the size of our old one, and with that came twice the work. The first day we moved in, Victoria was already barking orders, her high heels clicking menacingly on the marble floor as she directed the movers. Once the movers left, she turned her gaze on me. "Tasha, I expect you to take care of your own space. I won't have time to clean up after you." I was leaning against the doorframe, watching her. "Got it," I muttered, already dreading the long list of chores I knew she'd pile on me. "And dinner should be ready by 6 each evening. I assume you can handle that?" There was a challenge in her voice, like she doubted I could boil water without burning it. As the days turned into weeks, the house felt less like home and more like a fancy prison. Dad was out a lot, trying to keep his business afloat, which left me alone with Victoria and her endless list of demands. "Tasha, the living room is dusty. Tasha, the silver isn't polished. Tasha, did you forget the dry cleaning?" It was relentless. One afternoon, Dad finally noticed how tense things had become. He found me in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than needed. "Hey, Tasha, you've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" I threw a clump of weeds into the bin, wiping sweat off my brow. "Just tired, Dad. This place is a lot to keep up with." He looked around, his expression growing thoughtful. "Yeah, it's a lot for anyone. Maybe I can talk to Victoria, see if we can hire some help." I almost laughed. "Good luck with that. She thinks I'm her personal maid." Dad's face hardened slightly, something I hadn't seen in a while. "That's not what I intended when we moved here. I'll handle it, Tasha. You shouldn't have to carry all this weight." But despite his good intentions, conversations with Victoria seemed to go in one ear and out the other. She'd nod, smile that tight-lipped smile of hers, and then it was back to business as usual. "Tasha, the hedges are overgrown. Tasha, the guest rooms need fresh linens." It was exhausting, trying to meet her standards. But it made me stubborn, too. I wasn't going to let her break me. I'd do the work, keep my head down, and count the days until I could leave for college. The thought of getting out, of finding my own space where no one could tell me how to mop a floor or when dinner should be on the table, that kept me going. But finally, the day came. I was off to a place where my stepmother's voice couldn't reach me, a city miles away where I could start fresh. I packed up early that morning, each suitcase feeling like a brick in the new foundation I was laying for myself. Dad came out to see me off, his face trying to smile, but I could tell he was torn up about it. "Tasha, are you sure you've got everything you need?" Dad asked, looking over the pile of bags and boxes. "And you'll call if you need anything? Remember, the money for your rent and books, it'll be in your account. Check it when you get there." "Dad, relax. I'll be fine. I'm just going to college, not Mars." I was trying to keep it light, to make this easier for him, but my own heart was hammering in my chest. The freedom of living alone was everything I thought it would be, and more. My apartment was small, but it was mine. No one to tell me to clean up, no one to report to, just my own space. My classes were tough, but I was tougher. I was determined to make the most out of this opportunity, studying hard and keeping my grades up. It wasn't long before I realized that living on a tight budget wasn't as easy as I'd thought it would be. Money was always on my mind. I didn't go out much, didn't see the point in blowing cash on parties when I had a goal in mind. Instead, I picked up a part-time job at a local cafe. It wasn't glamorous, but it was income, and every little bit helped. One evening, my coworker, Mike, caught me counting my tips for the third time. He leaned against the counter, a smirk on his face. "What, you trying to make those bills multiply by staring at them?" I rolled my eyes, shoving the cash into my wallet. "Just making sure I got everything. Budgeting isn't exactly a thrill." Mike laughed, pulling off his apron as he prepared to close up. "You know, you could ease up a bit. Come out with us tonight. We're just grabbing a drink to unwind." I hesitated. It was tempting, but sorry, I can't. Need to save every penny I earn. Maybe next time. I was here to build a future, one where I'd be financially stable enough to never have to rely on anyone, Victoria or otherwise. I wanted to save enough to buy Dad something nice, something to show him how much I appreciated everything he'd done for me. Just when I thought I had my life at college figured out, everything started to unravel. It began with a call that I never saw coming. Victoria was on the other line, her voice cool and detached as she delivered the news that would turn my world upside down. "Tasha, your father's hit a rough patch financially," she said without a hint of sympathy. "We're tightening belts around here, and, unfortunately, this means we can't send you money for your rent anymore." The line went dead before I could protest further. I was stunned, the reality of my situation slowly setting in. No more money meant no more apartment on my own, no more safety net. I had to act fast. I explained my situation to Jenny, my college friend and classmate. She was as kind-hearted as they come, always ready to lend a hand or an ear, whichever you needed more. "Tasha, that's awful. Look, why don't you move in with me? We could split the rent, and it'll be cheaper for both of us," she offered, while we were studying in the library. Moving in with Jenny was a breath of fresh air during a suffocating time. We shared costs, which made life somewhat more manageable, but just as I was adjusting to this new normal, another blow came 6 months later. Victoria messaged me on a social network this time. "No more money for tuition either. Your father's situation hasn't improved. You need to stand on your own now." Reading those words, I felt a mix of anger and despair. My savings were meager at best, eaten away by bills and necessities. I tightened my budget even further, cutting down on everything non-essential, especially food. Meals became smaller, more about sustenance than enjoyment, and my clothes started hanging looser on my frame. One evening, Jenny knocked on my door, her arms laden with grocery bags. She must have noticed my weight loss. "Hey, I picked up some extra stuff. Made too much dinner, too. You should come eat with us." I peeked out, seeing the warm light and smelling the food from the kitchen. My stomach growled, but I shook my head. "Thanks, Jen, but I can't. I need to save every penny. I've got to pay for tuition somehow." Jenny frowned, setting her jaw stubbornly. "Tasha, you need to eat. And you're not paying for this, okay? It's just leftovers." I wanted to argue, to maintain that thread of independence I was clinging to, but another growl from my stomach betrayed me. "Okay, maybe just a little. Thanks, Jen." As the semester wore on, I threw myself into my studies with even more fervor, if that was possible. The only way out of this financial mess was through scholarships, and I wasn't about to let anything jeopardize that. Jenny often tried to coax me into taking breaks, coming to parties, or just hanging out with friends. "Tasha, come on, you can't study all the time. Come out with us tonight. It'll be fun, and you need a break." I always had the same answer. "I can't, Jen. I really need to ace these exams." "But you're always working or studying. When do you ever relax?" Jenny protested, her concern evident. "Relaxing doesn't pay the bills," I replied curtly, my eyes never leaving my books. As the pressure mounted, my body began to feel the strain. Long hours at my jobs, followed by longer nights of studying, left me exhausted, running on fumes. But I couldn't stop, not when I was so close to earning that scholarship, not when my entire future was on the line. The shift at the diner had dragged on forever, and by the time I clocked out, the sun was already painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Exhausted didn't even begin to cover how I felt, but classes waited for no one, and I had a midterm to prepare for. Dragging my feet to my apartment, I planned to grab a quick shower and head straight to campus. However, as I reached for my keys, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The world spun wildly, and the ground seemed to rush up to meet me. The last thing I remembered was the cold pavement against my cheek, then darkness. I woke up with a start, the sterile smell of antiseptic flooding my senses. Blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights, I found myself in a hospital bed, and 4 drip attached to my arm, and Jenny sitting by my side, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "Tasha, you're awake. God, you scared me. I found you passed out outside your apartment, Jenny said, her voice shaky. You collapsed, Tasha. The doctors said you're severely malnourished and dehydrated. You've been pushing yourself too hard. You need to rest. Rest was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not now. Not with everything hanging by a thread. But arguing felt like running a marathon, and I didn't have the energy. After a couple of days under observation, I was discharged with strict instructions to take it easy. Instructions that might as well have been written in sand for all the good they did. I headed straight home, my body weak, but my mind racing with all the things I needed to catch up on. Once home, I tried calling Dad. I needed to hear his voice, to tell him what happened. Maybe, just maybe, he could help. But the calls went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and feeling more alone than ever, I dialed Victoria's number next. She picked up on the third ring. Yes? It's Tasha. I started, but the words tangled up, thick with emotions I couldn't control. Your father is out of the country. Business, she interrupted sharply. And before you ask, no, we can't help. You're on your own. Her words hit like a slap. But There's nothing more to discuss, Tasha. You're an adult. Handle it. The line went dead, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I sat there, phone in hand, the weight of her dismissal crushing. It was then, in that quiet apartment, that the reality of my situation truly sank in. I was alone. Utterly and completely. Exams were creeping up, looming over me like dark clouds ready to burst. The stress was a tangible thing, wrapping its fingers around my throat, making it hard to breathe. To keep up with my studies, I had no choice but to let go of one of my jobs. Money, already a trickle, now felt like it had dried up to a few last drops. Sitting across from Jenny in the little diner we frequented, I fiddled with the edge of the menu, my stomach growling but my wallet painfully thin. Stop looking at the prices, Tasha. I've got this, okay? Jenny said, her voice firm but gentle. She was trying to be supportive, but accepting help never got easier. I'll pay you back. Every cent, I muttered, feeling the weight of each word. Jenny rolled her eyes, a smile tugging at her lips. Yeah, I know. Just order something hearty, all right? You look like you could use it. Reluctantly, I ordered the cheapest meal, my pride aching with every word. But Jenny was right, I needed the energy, especially now. As the exams rolled in, one after the other, I poured everything I had into them. Nights blurred into days, textbooks and notes scattered around me like a fortress. When the results came in, I couldn't believe my eyes, straight A's. A tuition bonus followed, a small but significant light at the end of a very dark tunnel. I should have been over the moon, but all I could do was collapse into bed, my body and mind shutting down from sheer exhaustion. I slept for days, missing calls and messages, the world moving on without me. One night, wrapped in the solitude of my small apartment, I dreamt of Mom. She was in our old kitchen, humming a tune, her smile warm and inviting. Tasha, come here, sweetheart, she called, her voice a soft echo of better days. In my dream, I went to her, basking in the feeling of being home, being safe. But as dreams do, it ended, and I woke up in tears, the ache in my chest raw and fierce. The emptiness of the apartment was suffocating, and a desperate need to connect with her overwhelmed me. I made a decision then, one that felt like grasping at straws but necessary. I would go back to my hometown, visit her grave, and maybe, just maybe, find some of that peace I saw in my dream. Checking my bank account, I calculated what I could afford, a cheap bus ticket, the cheapest I could find. Work could do without me for a couple of days, I wasn't much use to them or anyone else in my current state anyway. Jen, I'm going home for a couple of days, I told her over the phone, my voice more steady than I felt. Home? There was a pause, and I could picture her brow furrowing in concern. Are you sure that's a good idea? Okay, but call me, alright? Anytime, day or night. Promise? Promise, I said, feeling a thread of warmth at her concern. The journey back was a blur, my thoughts a tangled mess of memories and what-ifs. As the bus rolled into the familiar streets of my hometown, a mixture of dread and longing settled in my stomach. It was supposed to be a simple visit, a moment to feel close to Mom again, but as I walked among the familiar gravestones, a figure in the distance caught my eye. My heart skipped, tall, with a familiar stoop of the shoulders, kneeling by a grave. My pace quickened, disbelief and hope churning within me. "Dad?" My voice was tentative, almost afraid to shatter the fragile moment. The figure turned, and our eyes met. There was a flicker of confusion, then recognition, and something that looked a lot like sorrow. "Tasha?" His voice broke, raw with emotion. It had been so long. I ran to him, no longer caring about the cold or the tears that had started to spill over. "Dad, what are you doing here?" He rose quickly, nearly stumbling in his haste, and enveloped me in his arms. I was suddenly 5 years old again, safe and cherished. I had a dream about your mother," he confessed, pulling back just enough to see my face. "She told me to come here today." I gasped, the parallel too stark to ignore. I had a dream about her, too. That's why I'm here. Dad wiped away my tears with an old handkerchief, rough and a bit frayed. "Seems like she's still looking out for us, huh?" "Yeah, seems like it," I agreed, laughter mingling with my tears. "We should talk, Tasha. Come back to the house with me," Dad suggested, his tone hopeful yet cautious. I hesitated, images of Victoria's cold stares flashing through my mind. "Are you sure? What about Victoria?" "She'll manage. You're my daughter, and we have a lot to catch up on." His voice held a firmness I hadn't heard in a long time. The ride to the house was filled with an awkward yet comforting silence. When we arrived, Victoria was in the front yard, pruning roses with sharp snips that seemed to echo her mood. "Tasha? What are you doing here?" She stood up straight, her eyes narrowing as she took in my presence. I stepped forward, bolstered by Dad's presence. "I came to see Dad. We have some things to talk about." Dad nodded at Victoria. "Why don't you make us some dinner? We'll be inside." Her mouth tightened, but she nodded stiffly and headed inside. Dad led me into the living room, a space that once felt warm but now seemed curated for appearance rather than comfort. The tension in the dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victoria, looking paler than usual, was fussing about leaving the house on some urgent errand, but Dad's voice stopped her cold. "Sit down, we're not done here." Reluctantly, Victoria sat, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Dad turned his attention to me, his brow furrowed in concern. "Tasha, you've lost so much weight. Are you on some sort of diet?" I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping me. "Diet? Hardly. It's not choice, Dad, it's necessity. I've been struggling to make ends meet because I've been paying for my tuition and all my living expenses by myself." His confusion was apparent. "What are you talking about?" "I've been sending $3,000 every month to cover your expenses. It's been sent to your account on the 15th every month without fail." I stared at him, stunned. "What? Dad, I haven't seen a dime of that money for the last 2 years. I've been working 2 jobs just to pay my bills and tuition." The color drained from Dad's face as he turned to Victoria. "Is this true? Where's the money, Victoria?" Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. I needed it. It wasn't supposed to be permanent." Dad's voice was a low growl. "Tell me everything. Now." She hesitated, then spilled the beans. "I got involved in a financial pyramid scheme. I thought I could make a quick buck, turn around our financial woes, but I ended up in debt. The people I dealt with, they're not the kind you say no to. I used Tasha's money to pay them off. I thought I could replace it before anyone noticed." Dad's hands were shaking. "You endangered my daughter's health, her education, over a get-rich-quick scam? And you hid this from me?" "I didn't know what to do," Victoria whimpered, her usual composure shattered. "You're going to leave. Tonight. Dad said firmly, standing up. And we're done here. I want a divorce. After Victoria hurriedly packed some belongings and left, Dad turned to me, his eyes filled with sorrow. Tasha, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. From now on, I'll handle your finances directly. No more middlemen. I managed a small smile. Actually, Dad, I got a scholarship recently. Tuition's covered. His eyes lit up, pride overtaking the anger. That's my girl. Always making me proud. But you deserve a break. How about a vacation? A real one, by the sea. You've earned it. The vacation was like a dream. Blue skies, golden beaches, and the soothing sound of waves. It was a chance to recharge, to put the struggles and pain behind me. I returned with a renewed vigor, ready to tackle my studies with fresh enthusiasm. Now, back at school, I still worked part-time, not out of necessity, but to save up for something special, a gift for Dad, a thank you for everything. Despite the hardships, the challenges, I found myself attending the occasional party with friends, allowing myself to enjoy life, not just endure it. I see you're going out more, Jenny noted one evening as I dressed up. Yeah, trying to find a balance. I guess I'm learning it's okay to have a little fun, I replied, adjusting my earrings. Just don't forget about us when you're famous, she joked, throwing a cushion at me. I won't. Could never, I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a reflection of someone who'd been through a storm and emerged stronger. I was still careful with money, some habits are hard to shake, but now it was not out of desperation, but out of a desire to build a future I chose. A future that was finally looking bright. Things were tough. After losing my job as a retail manager, it felt like every door in the industry slammed shut right in front of me. Months of job hunting led nowhere. It was Lisa, one of my oldest friends, who finally threw me a lifeline, albeit not the kind I expected. Tessa, why don't you help out Tom? She suggested one afternoon as we sipped coffee at my cramped kitchen table. His place is a mess since his wife passed, and he could use someone to tidy up and maybe look after Jamie, the little one. I needed the cash. Desperation edged out pride, and I agreed. Lisa set up the meeting, and 2 days later, I found myself standing at Tom's door, my stomach in knots. Tom opened the door, a man in his mid-40s, with weary blue eyes and a tentative smile. You must be Tessa. Lisa told me a lot about you. Come in, don't just stand there. The apartment was larger than I expected, a bit of dust here and there, but it felt like a place sucked dry of life, echoing with a silence that spoke of its missing joy. Let me show you around, Tom said as he led me through the living room filled with pictures of a woman with a bright smile, his late wife, I assumed. We moved on to the kitchen, which looked like it hadn't seen a proper cleaning in weeks. I know it's a mess. I'm not around much, work and all. And Jamie, well, he's 9. You can imagine. Tom chuckled dryly, his gaze flicking away. There is also Mike, my eldest son, but he lives separately. There was an awkward silence before he hastily added. So, about the job, I guess Lisa told you the basics? Yeah, cleaning, cooking a bit, and helping Jamie with his homework? I confirmed. That's about it. You'll have free run of the place during the day. I just really need someone to keep things afloat here. I nodded, understanding the weight of his admission. I can do that, Tom. You can count on me. He showed a small, relieved smile. Thanks, Tessa. Let's see how it goes, yeah? Tom introduced me to Jamie that evening. The kid was a mop of untidy hair with curious eyes and a suspicious look as he sized me up from his spot on the living room couch. You gonna be our new maid? He asked bluntly, his voice sharp. I guess you could say that. But I'm also here to help you out with your studies and stuff, I replied, trying to make my tone as friendly as possible. As I left their apartment that day, I felt a mix of emotions swirling within me. This was not the life I had planned, but somehow, it felt like exactly where I needed to be. The early days at Tom's apartment were like walking a tightrope. I kept busy scrubbing, cooking, and learning the ropes of managing a household that wasn't mine. It wasn't long before the place started looking more like a home than a storage unit. Tom seemed appreciative, though he was a man of few words. One Tuesday morning, I was elbow-deep in suds, scrubbing a stubborn stain off a frying pan when Jamie wandered into the kitchen. His hair was even messier than usual, and he had that scowl that seemed glued to his face. "Hey, you missed a spot," he said, pointing at a corner of the floor I hadn't gotten to yet. I rinsed the pan and turned to him, wiping my hands on my apron. "Want to give me a hand?" I asked. He rolled his eyes. "No way, that's your job." "Sure, but wouldn't hurt to help out a bit. Maybe learn something useful." I shot back with a half-smile, hoping to tease a bit of cooperation out of him. Jamie huffed, crossing his arms. "Whatever." That afternoon, I caught him struggling with his math homework. Numbers spread out on the table like they were parts of a puzzle he couldn't put together. I sat down next to him, my fingers tapping the table lightly. "Stuck?" I asked, glancing at the jumble of equations. "It's dumb. I don't get why I gotta learn this crap," he muttered, shoving the workbook away. "Let me show you something," I said, pulling the book back between us. For the next hour, I broke down the problems into steps that even I would have understood back in school. Slowly, Jamie started getting the hang of it, and when he solved the last problem on his own, he couldn't hide a proud grin. As days turned into weeks, I found myself more involved in their lives than I'd originally signed up for. Tom started coming home earlier, sometimes even helping with dinner. One evening, while I was chopping vegetables, he leaned against the counter, watching me work. "You've changed things around here, Tessa. For the better," he said, his voice low and sincere. "More than that. You're making us a family again." The word family hung in the air, heavy, but not unwelcome. I nodded, unsure of what to say, focusing instead on the carrots I was slicing. "Tessa," Tom continued, hesitating for a moment. "I was thinking, maybe it's time we made this arrangement a bit more permanent." I stopped chopping, my heart skipping a beat. "Permanent?" "Yeah, I mean, if you're up for it. I could use someone like you around, long term. Not just for the cleaning and cooking, but, you know, for everything." The offer caught me off guard. I took a deep breath, considering the weight of his words. I'd like that, Tom. I really would." From that point on, things felt different. Easier, somehow. Jamie started calling me by my first name instead of the maid, and Tom treated me more like a partner than an employee. We settled into a comfortable routine, the three of us, like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their right place. Tom proposed one chilly evening, Jamie asleep, and his voice was steady, but his hands shook just a bit. "Tessa, I don't have much to offer but myself and this family. Will you marry me?" he had asked, his eyes hopeful yet scared of rejection. I didn't need a second to think about it. "Yes, Tom. Yes, I will." But not everyone was thrilled. When I told my mom, she was less than enthusiastic. "He's 14 years older than you, Tessa. And those kids. Are you ready to be a stepmom?" Her skepticism was like a bucket of cold water. "We love each other, Ma. That's what matters. And Jamie and Mike? They're great kids. I can handle it," I countered, but she wasn't convinced. And so, she came around, showing up at the mayor's office on our wedding day in her best dress, her smile tight but genuine. The ceremony was brief, the mayor reciting the vows with all the enthusiasm of someone who'd done this too many times. But when Tom slipped the ring on my finger, it felt like the world just paused for us. Starting our married life, I transitioned from the hired help to the lady of the house. It felt different waking up and not having to prove my worth through scrubbed floors and spotless counters. I was more than the cleaner now. I was a wife, a stepmom, part of a family. Life felt fuller, richer. But being a stepmom came with its own rulebook, one that nobody handed you, you just had to fumble through it. Jamie, who I'd thought of as my little buddy, suddenly seemed to realize I was in his mom's spot. Why do you always have to tell me what to do? He'd challenge, his little face scrunched up in annoyance. Because I care about you, Jamie. It's part of my job now. I'd explain, trying to keep my tone light, but firm. And then there were the everyday adjustments, the dance of a new marriage. Tom had his ways I hadn't noticed when I was just the housekeeper. Like how he insisted on having dinner at exactly 6, or how the furniture shouldn't be moved even an inch from where Laura had placed it. Tessa, why did you move the couch? He'd ask, his voice more of confusion than anger. Just trying something new, mixing it up a bit, I'd reply, pushing the couch back reluctantly under his watchful eyes. Let's keep it the original way. It's how Laura liked it, he'd say, and that was that. Laura's ghost hovered in the corners, her touch lingering in the arrangement of cushions and photo frames. A few months later, Tom asked me to come to work for the sake of an additional source of income. It was okay, but I was upset by the demanding tone of his voice. I got a job at a store nearby to keep up with cooking and cleaning the house. Family life has not turned out to be as easy as I once imagined it would be. A year into our marriage, I started feeling like a guest in what was supposed to be my home. Tom seemed to have rules that never came up when we were dating, like an invisible playbook I wasn't privy to. It all came to a head one afternoon when I decided to switch out the old rug in the bathroom. It was a simple change, nothing drastic, just a new rug to brighten up the space. But when Tom came home and saw it, you'd think I'd redecorated the whole apartment. What's this? He stood in the bathroom doorway, his brow furrowed as he pointed at the rug. A new rug. The old one was getting moldy, I said, trying to keep my voice light, hoping to head off any drama. Why didn't you ask me? You know how I feel about changing things around here. His tone was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. I didn't think a rug would be a big deal, Tom. I felt my defenses rising. Well, it is. I want things left the way they were. He was practically glaring at me now, and the intensity caught me off guard. That night at dinner, things went from bad to worse. Tom's younger son, Jamie, had been struggling at school, and somehow that was my fault too. Jamie's grades are slipping. What's going on with his homework? Tom asked, his eyes fixed on me across the table. I've been busy, Tom. I started that job at the store, remember? You wanted me to help out with money. I replied, my voice tight with frustration. So you're just going to let everything else slide? He was accusatory now, his voice raising a notch. I'm doing my best here. I shot back, feeling the weight of his expectations crushing me. It doesn't seem good enough. The house is a mess, and you're not keeping up with Jamie like you used to. Laura would have handled it better. The mention of his late wife was a low blow, and it hit its mark. I was silent, the hurt too deep to respond. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence. The troubles didn't stop at Tom. Jamie, seeing how his father treated me, started pushing boundaries too. One evening, I caught him up late on his computer, way past his bedtime. Jamie, it's late. You need to turn off the computer and go to bed, I said as calmly as I could. You're not my mom. You can't tell me what to do. His voice was loud, challenging. I'm not trying to be your mom, Jamie. But you have school tomorrow, and you need your rest. He scoffed, turning back to his screen. Whatever, Dad, he yelled, calling for backup. Tom came in, his face set in a hard line. Let him be, Tessa. He's fine. But he needs to sleep. It's not good for him to stay up so late. He's my son, I think I know what's best for him. Tom's tone was final, leaving no room for argument. Feeling undermined and disrespected, I retreated, the gap between us growing wider by the day. I started to feel like nothing more than a housekeeper, a nanny, someone who was there to cook and clean and then step out of the way. The day I got a bonus at work should have been a joyous occasion. With the extra money, I did something I hadn't done in a long while. I bought myself a new dress. It was nothing extravagant, just a simple, pretty thing that made me feel good when I tried it on. I was wearing the dress when I got home, a small smile playing on my lips as I imagined Tom's surprise. He noticed all right, but not the way I had hoped. "What's that?" he asked, his tone harsh as he eyed my new purchase. "It's just a dress, Tom. I bought it with my bonus," I said, twirling a little to show it off, trying to lighten the mood. "A bonus, huh? And you thought the best thing to spend it on was a dress?" His voice rose with each word. I stopped twirling, feeling the happiness drain out of me. "I thought it was okay to treat myself." "Treat yourself?" Tom scoffed. "That money could have gone to something we actually needed. Like bills. Or saving up for something important." Before I could respond, Jamie chimed in from the doorway, his voice bitter. "Yeah, or maybe a new console that I've been asking for." I looked from Jamie to Tom, my heart sinking. It was my bonus. I just wanted something nice. The room filled with a heavy silence, Tom's eyes cold and unyielding, Jamie's stare accusing. That night, they both started treating me like I was invisible, not a word or a glance in my direction unless absolutely necessary. This silent treatment went on for a week. Meals passed in silence, my attempts at conversation met with cold shoulders and dismissive grunts. It was like I didn't exist in my own home. But life has a way of testing you with more than you think you can handle. A couple of years later, during the pandemic, my mother passed away. It was a sudden and heart-wrenching loss, leaving me to inherit the family house, a large, old structure, along with a significant sum of money. When I told Tom about the inheritance, his eyes lit up in a way that made me uncomfortable. "We'll move there," he declared one evening, looking over the property papers. "It's bigger, and the school near there is perfect for Jamie." I nodded, too drained from grieving to argue or to ponder his sudden interest in my inheritance. "Yes, maybe a new place will give us a fresh start," I said, hoping his intentions were as genuine as my wishes. "We'll start packing up this weekend," Tom decided, already making plans. Packing was a slow process, each item a memory, each box a step toward a new life I hoped would be better. As the moving day approached, I found myself observing Tom and Jamie, watching them discuss room arrangements and renovations for the new house. Their enthusiasm was hard to gauge. Was it for the new start or for what the new house represented? That morning, I wasn't feeling great, my head was pounding, and my stomach was in knots. The store manager noticed my pale face and sent me home early, something I was grateful for. I let myself in with my key, expecting the usual silence, but instead, I was met with low, conspiratorial voices drifting from Tom's makeshift office. Instinctively, I pressed myself against the wall by the door, my breath catching in my throat as I listened. "Yeah, Dad, thanks for setting that up. Leaving the apartment to me is a big help," said Mike, Tom's eldest son, his voice a mix of gratitude and scheming. "No problem, Mike. Once we move into Tessa's place, I'll have more than enough. We'll live there a bit, I'll spend her money, and then I'll find a good reason to divorce her. We'll split the assets, easy." Tom's voice was cold, calculated. I felt a chill run down my spine. The pain of the betrayal was sharp, like a knife twisting in my gut. Mike laughed, a harsh sound that filled the room. "Man, your new girlfriend is way hotter than Tessa. Can't wait for you to ditch that stupid chicken." I stood frozen, not wanting to alert them to my presence. After a few moments, I quietly backed away from the door, my mind racing. The initial shock was giving way to a burning, seething anger. I had to act, but I needed to be smart. I left the apartment as silently as I had entered and headed straight to the lawyer's office. The lawyer, Mr. Reynolds, was a sharp-eyed man who listened intently as I laid everything out. "This is more common than you'd think," he said, his voice even. "But you've got a good head on your shoulders, and we'll make sure you come out of this on top." I nodded, feeling a semblance of control returning. "What are the next steps?" I asked. "We file for divorce on grounds of infidelity and deception. Gather any evidence you can. Recordings, documents, anything that shows his intent," Mr. Reynolds advised. "Thank you. I'll get everything ready," I said, standing up. The weight of the legal folder in my hand felt like a shield, something to protect me from the storm ahead. As I walked home, my mind was a whirl of plans and possibilities. When I returned home, Tom was in the kitchen, making dinner as if nothing had happened. Mike had left, and the normalcy of the scene was almost surreal. "Hey, you're back early. Feeling any better?" Tom asked, looking up from the stove. I forced a smile, my heart pounding in my chest. "A bit, yeah. Just tired," I said, keeping my voice light. "That's good. Dinner will be ready soon. Why don't you go lie down for a bit?" he suggested, turning back to his cooking. "Sure, I might just do that," I said, my voice sweet as syrup, but inside, I was steeling myself for the battle ahead. I went to our room, closed the door softly, and sat on the edge of the bed. The next few weeks would define the rest of my life. I wasn't just going to roll over and let Tom take everything from me, not without a fight. The morning of the move felt different. I had everything planned down to the last detail, and Tom had no clue about the storm that was about to hit him. I'd packed my personal belongings quietly over the past few weeks and had them moved to a new place in another city, a fresh start, a new me. This morning, I left the house as usual, a simple handbag in tow, telling Tom I was off to work early. "See you at the new house later," he called out nonchalantly, completely unaware of the bomb about to drop. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Sure, see you there," I lied smoothly, closing the door behind me with a soft click that marked the end of my old life. Meanwhile, Tom and Jamie were supposed to meet the movers at my inherited house and relocate our family there. What Tom didn't know was that there was no family to relocate anymore, and that house wasn't ours to call home any longer. I waited patiently in my new apartment, my heart racing as I pictured the scene unfolding at the old house. At exactly 10 a.m., my phone buzzed, a message from my neighbor who was keeping an eye out. "He's there, looks confused," it read. Tom must have been standing at the door, expecting to walk into his new life. Instead, he was greeted by strangers, the new owners of the house I had sold right from under him. I imagined his face, the confusion morphing into realization and then anger as he processed the betrayal. According to my neighbor, Tom knocked on the door, and a confused couple opened it, introducing themselves. "We just bought this place. Who are you?" they would have asked, just as baffled by the presence of a moving truck full of furniture. The movers, equally perplexed, started asking where to put the boxes, and Tom, flustered and furious, tried to call me. My phone lit up with his number, but I ignored it, sticking to the plan. When no answers came, he had no choice but to return to his apartment, where another surprise awaited him. Mike, his eldest son, had moved in his own furniture, and his fiancée was already unpacking. The apartment was no longer Tom's sanctuary but a crowded mess of broken plans and shattered expectations. "Get out! This is still my place!" Tom must have roared, the vein in his neck throbbing with rage. "Dad, we gave up the lease on our apartment. We've got nowhere to go," Mike shot back, defiant and desperate. Finally, I picked up the phone after his third, more frantic call. Tom's voice was livid, tinged with a betrayal he thought only he was capable of. "Tessa, what the hell do you think you're doing? Why are you ruining everything?" I took a deep breath, my voice calm and resolute. "I know about everything, Tom. The plans you made with Mike, the girlfriend, your charming little comments. I've sold the house and protected my assets. You won't use me anymore. You can't do this to me. We're married." His voice was a mix of anger and disbelief. "The divorce papers are in your mailbox," I replied firmly. "Consider this me looking out for myself. You'll also find that I will be asking for alimony." I didn't pick up his calls after that. My old phone, the one he knew the number to, would soon be turned off for good. I sat back, a weight lifting off my shoulders. I was free, truly free for the first time in what felt like forever. The courtroom was charged with tension. My ex-husband Tom sat across from me, his face a mask of fury and desperation. He was gunning for half of everything I owned, but I was armed with the truth, and a stellar lawyer. My lawyer, Mr. Reynolds, was a no-nonsense type who had every piece of evidence neatly organized and ready to dismantle Tom's claims. Your Honor, we have substantial proof of Mr. Wright's infidelity, and we intend to show that his demands for property share are not only baseless but also immoral, he stated confidently as the proceedings began. Tom's lawyer tried to paint a picture of a broken man wronged by his wife's sudden departure, but it fell flat as soon as Mr. Reynolds presented the evidence. Receipts from lavish dinners, hotel bookings for two, and love letters to another woman, every item displayed on the projector screen was another nail in the coffin of Tom's credibility. When it was time for testimonies, a couple of acquaintances from our old neighborhood took the stand. They didn't mince words. I saw him at the lake with her. They were all over each other like teenagers. One testified, her tone disgusted. Tom's lawyer tried to counter, arguing about the legitimacy and relevance of the evidence, but it was clear the judge wasn't buying it. The atmosphere was thick with Tom's silent rage, I could almost feel it across the room. Finally, the judge delivered her verdict. Given the evidence of infidelity and deception presented by the plaintiff, I find it impossible to grant any property claims to Mr. Wright. Furthermore, considering the income disparity, Mr. Wright is ordered to pay alimony. Tom's face went from red to white, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was a sight I didn't enjoy, but it was justice, plain and simple. His mistress had left him once she realized there was no lavish lifestyle waiting for her, especially when she found out she'd have to share an apartment with his sons and his eldest son's fiancée. "I'm not going to be a free housekeeper," she'd said, echoing the irony of my past with Tom. As for Tom, he ended up exactly where he put himself. His battles with his eldest son over space and responsibilities were the stuff of local gossip. Jamie, the younger one, turned into a defiant teenager, harder to handle every day without a steady maternal influence. Meanwhile, I was building a new life far from that chaos. I took up courses in graphic design, something I'd always had a knack for but never pursued. The community here was vibrant and supportive, helping me network and establish a small freelance business. I was happy starting over. I'm Sarah, and if you had told me that falling in love would lead me straight into a battlefield, I might have stayed single. But here we are, or rather, here I was, fresh into medical school, with dreams bigger than my budget. I had been studying at the college for a couple of years, living off ramen and coffee, and picking up night shifts at the local hospital to keep the lights on. Then, at a typical blowout student party, filled with too loud music and cheap beer, I met Tom. Tom was something else, polite, a bit too clean-cut for these parties, and always with a clever comment. He was studying law, and not just anywhere, but at one of those schools where his classmates were more likely to end up on TV than not. "Hey, I haven't seen you around before," I said, making my way through the crowd to where he was standing by the makeshift bar. He looked up, a bit surprised, then shot me a smile. Just hiding from the chaos. "Tom," he extended his hand, which I shook, feeling the firmness of his grip. "Sarah," I replied. "Med student by day, coffee zombie by night." He laughed. "Sounds intense. Law's a snooze fest compared to that." We hit it off instantly. Within weeks, Tom and I were a thing, and I was happy. I mean, really happy. Then came the day he wanted me to meet his folks. I should have seen the storm coming. His parents lived in one of those massive houses where you could play hide and seek and actually need to call for help to find each other. I remember standing at their door, decked out in the nicest dress I owned, which suddenly felt too plain. Tom's mom, Mrs. Waverly, opened the door, and her eyes did a quick scan from my head to my toes. The chill in her hello could have frosted a cake. "Mom, this is Sarah." "Sarah, my mother," Tom introduced us, unaware of the ice in the air. Mrs. Waverly forced a smile. "Pleasure. Come in." Dinner was like sitting in a court where I was both the accused and the only witness. The table was set like something out of a magazine, with more forks and knives than I knew what to do with. "So, Sarah, Tom tells us you're in medical school. That must be interesting." Mr. Waverley said, in a tone that suggested he found it anything but. It is, sir. Every day's a new challenge, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Waverley joined in, her words sharp and quick. And you work as well? A nurse, was it? Yes, at the city hospital. It's a good experience, I said, feeling my face heat up. She smirked. Oh, a nurse. Well, we always need someone to clean up, don't we? Mr. Waverley, meanwhile, had excused himself, mentioning something about needing to check on some work in his study. A convenient escape. The rest of the evening didn't improve. Mrs. Waverley's comments ranged from my family background, so, your parents do, what exactly, to my attire, that dress is, interesting. Where did you get it? Each word was a barb, each glance a judgment. I wanted to defend myself, to tell her that I was more than my job, more than my clothes, more than the sum of my bank account. But I bit my tongue, for Tom's sake. As we drove home, the coldness of that night settled deep in my bones. I turned to Tom, trying to lighten the mood. How about we just elope? I half-joked, imagining a small, quiet wedding, just the two of us. Tom didn't laugh. He looked at me, dead serious. Sarah, I want the big day, gala, guests, the whole 9 yards. We just gotta warm up to my parents a bit more, especially you. His words felt like a bucket of ice water. I nodded, hiding my disappointment. Okay, we'll try it your way, I said, though my stomach knotted at the thought. Not a week later, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Waverley. Sarah, darling, could you pop over this afternoon? I need a bit of help around the house. Her voice was sweet, which should have been my first warning. Something about her tone didn't sit right, but I agreed. I baked some cupcakes, chocolate, everyone's favorite, or so I thought, and dressed in my prettiest casual dress, hoping to make a better impression. When I arrived, the house loomed large and unfriendly, just like my memories of it. Mrs. Waverley met me at the door, not with a smile, but with a mop and a bucket. Oh good, you're here. The housekeeper's sick, and we're in a dreadful state. You don't mind helping out, do you? I stood there, cupcakes in hand, now holding a mop. No, of course not, I stammered, more out of shock than willingness. Great. Start in the kitchen. And you can just leave those. She nodded disdainfully at my cupcakes. In the trash. I don't eat that. My cheeks burned, but I swallowed the hurt. I wasn't going to let her see me upset. I moved to the kitchen and started scrubbing. The house was massive, and cleaning it felt like an endless task. As I worked, I could hear laughter from the pool area where Mrs. Waverley and her friends lounged. Hours later, hands raw and back aching, I called out, Mrs. Waverley, I've finished. Is there anything else? She sauntered in, inspecting my work with a hawk's eye, searching for any speck of dust to criticize. Finally, she had to concede. Well, it does look spotless. You do know your way around a mop, Sarah. How about twice a week then? I stared at her, mouth agape. I have my studies, night shifts at the hospital, and my thesis. Mrs. Waverley's face hardened. Listen, dear, if you want to be part of this family, these are the hoops you jump through. Tom's waiting for us to get along. Don't disappoint him, or me. The threat was clear. Marry Tom, clean the house. Don't and well, the alternative wasn't an option. Okay, I muttered, defeated. Twice a week, I came, I cleaned, and each time, Mrs. Waverley found new ways to remind me of where I came from and where she thought I belonged. Twice a week, like clockwork, I scrubbed and cleaned Tom's family mansion. It wasn't what I signed up for when I imagined a life with him, but Mrs. Waverley seemed to have decided my role long before I even had a say. You look just right with a mop, Sarah. It suits you better than a stethoscope ever will. She would taunt as she watched me from her perch, sipping her expensive tea. Nobody knew about this arrangement, not Tom, not his dad. Just me and Mrs. Waverley in this twisted secret of servitude. She never paid me, Instead, she paid with sharp jabs about my background, about how I was practically a charity case they had taken in. The year wore on, and between the cleaning, my intern shifts at the hospital, and my studies, my graduation project nearly suffered. But I powered through, fueled by the dream of the day I could finally call myself a doctor. Amid all this, wedding plans buzzed in the background. Mrs. Waverly took the reins, dictating everything from the napkin folds to the guest list. "We need to teach you how to not embarrass us," she declared one afternoon, enrolling me in an etiquette school. "You can't go around looking like a hillbilly at your own wedding." The etiquette classes were a whole new level of humiliation. The instructor, a stern woman named Mrs. Penrose, had no patience for my lack of sophistication. "No, no, no. It's left hand on the lap, right hand for the fork. Have you never dined anywhere that didn't have plastic cutlery?" she chided during one of our sessions. "I'm trying my best," I muttered, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks as I fumbled with the silverware again. Mrs. Penrose sighed, a sound of weary frustration. "Your best needs to get a lot better. This is basic, my dear." As if the etiquette lessons weren't enough, Mrs. Waverly's next project was dance lessons, and then, French lessons. "You'll sing a lovely French song at the wedding," she announced with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I can't even sing in English, Mrs. Waverly. And I really don't have time to learn French," I protested, but my words fell on deaf ears. When I brought up these absurd demands to Tom, hoping for some support, he only tightened his lips and repeated the family mantra. "My mom's just looking out for us. You know how important this is. Just stick with it, okay?" I felt a mixture of anger and helplessness. It wasn't just the cleaning or the classes, it was his inability to see how much I was struggling just to fit into this image his mother had crafted for me. I remember walking into the dance studio, my body aching from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, and meeting my dance instructor, a lively man named Marco who seemed to dance rather than walk. "Light on your feet, eh? Let's see what you've got," Marco chuckled, putting on some classical music. I tried to follow along, but my movements were clumsy, my mind too full of medical terminologies and French vocab I had crammed the night before. Whoa, it's dancing, not wrestling," Marco laughed, stopping the music. "Relax, you're too stiff. Imagine you're floating." "Floating's hard when you feel like sinking," I admitted, half laughing at my own sad joke. As I lay in bed that night, the weight of the world seemed to press down on me. Etiquette, dancing, French, cleaning, each demand piling on top of the last until I felt I could barely breathe. The wedding was fast approaching, and the tension was as thick as the fancy curtains in Tom's family living room. Mrs. Waverly, always plotting, decided a bachelorette party was in order, a final hurrah before the big day, she said. I arrived at their house, dressed casually but elegantly, hoping to at least enjoy an evening without tasks or lessons. Mrs. Waverly greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sarah, darling, so glad you could make it. Here, you must try some of this champagne, it's from Tom's father's collection." I hesitated. "Oh, I don't really drink," I murmured, trying not to make a scene. "Nonsense," she laughed, handing me a flute filled with bubbly liquid. "It's a celebration. Just one glass won't hurt." The room was filled with her friends, all elegantly dressed, their eyes sharp and calculating like birds of prey. Feeling the pressure, I took a small sip to appease her, intending to set the glass down and forget it. But the room started spinning soon after, and everything became a blur. I woke up suddenly to the harsh sensation of cold water splashing on my face. Mrs. Waverly stood over me, her expression twisted with fake concern that quickly shifted to scorn. "Look at you. Drunk and passed out. How disgraceful." I blinked, trying to orient myself. The room was still spinning, and I could hear murmurs and snickers around me. My eyes found Tom and his father, both staring down at a phone. Mr. Waverly's voice boomed. "This is outrageous. I knew she wasn't right for our family." "What's going on?" I managed to stammer, my voice hoarse, my mind racing to piece together the situation. Mr. Waverly, face red with anger, thrust the phone at me. The screen showed pictures of me, but not just any pictures. In them, I was sprawled on the couch, my clothing disheveled to reveal my underwear, a bottle of alcohol carelessly placed in my limp hand, and a cigarette dangling from my lips. My eyes were closed, head lolling in a way that screamed of a setup. I felt my heart sink. "I didn't do this," I whispered, looking up at them, my plea clear in my eyes. Tom looked from the phone to me, his expression torn. Mrs. Waverly cut in, her voice sharp. "Oh please, look at yourself. Do you expect us to believe you're innocent? This is who you really are, Sarah." "No, you've got to listen to me," I started, my voice gaining strength as I found my footing, despite the dizziness. "I didn't drink that much. Just one glass, and I didn't even want it. Something was in that drink, you did this." Mrs. Waverly feigned shock, her hand at her chest. "How dare you accuse me of such a thing? After all we've done for you, this is how you repay our kindness?" The room was thick with tension, the air almost suffocating as accusations flew. Standing there, soaked and humiliated, I knew I had to take control of the situation. "I'm going to the hospital," I declared, my voice steady, despite the chaos. "I'll donate blood for tests. If they find anything, any drug that shouldn't be there, I'm reporting this to the police." Mrs. Waverly's face drained of color, her usual composure slipping as the gravity of my words hit her. She glanced around, her eyes darting between the shocked faces of her guests and her family. "It was just a sleeping pill," she blurted out, the words spilling from her lips in a panicked rush. "I just wanted to lighten up the party. I didn't mean any harm." Tom's face was a mix of anger and disbelief. "Mom, how could you?" He turned to me, his eyes softening. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. Please, let's not involve the police. Think about the family's reputation." I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the desperation in his eyes. It was always about the family's reputation, wasn't it? Never about what was right. "I won't go to the police," I said slowly, "but on one condition." "What is it?" Tom asked, relief flickering in his eyes. "I'm not your family's cleaner. Not anymore. And I'm certainly not working for free." The silence that followed was heavy. Tom and Mr. Waverly exchanged looks of shock, clearly unaware of what I had been put through. Mrs. Waverly attempted to smile, her usual charm seeping through her facade. "Let's not dwell on past misunderstandings. We were all preparing for the wedding, after all." I cut her off, my patience wearing thin. "It's not a misunderstanding. For the past year, your wife has had me cleaning your house under the pretense that it was just helping out. I was never paid, and all the while, she pocketed the money meant for the cleaner." Mr. Waverly turned to his wife, his voice low and dangerous. "Is this true, Helen?" She hesitated, then nodded, her eyes avoiding mine. "I thought it would be a good test of her character," she muttered. "Test of her character?" I echoed, incredulous. "Is that what you call exploitation?" Mr. Waverly's face was a mask of anger and embarrassment. He looked from his wife to me, the pieces falling into place. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I had no idea." Tom took my hand, his touch gentle. "The wedding is still on if you want it." "I'm sorry for all of this. Really sorry." I nodded, accepting his apology, but feeling the weight of his mother's gaze on me. As the room began to clear, Mrs. Waverly leaned in, her whisper harsh against my ear. "I'll find a way to separate you two. This isn't over." On the day of my wedding, draped in a gown that made me feel like a princess out of a fairy tale, I was floating on air. Yet, every so often, Mrs. Waverly's thinly veiled threats echoed in my mind, casting long shadows over my joy. As we stood at the altar, Mrs. Waverly approached, her steps measured, her smile too sweet. "Sarah, dear, it's time for your surprise. Remember? You promised to delight us with a little French song." Her voice was light, but her eyes glittered with mischief. I froze, the words hitting me like ice water. I'm not ready to sing, especially not in French, I whispered, turning towards Tom with a desperate look. Tom, caught in the middle of his mother's schemes and his own desire to keep the peace, seemed conflicted. He gave me a tight smile. Come on, Sarah, it's just a song. Let's not upset anyone. Do it for the family, for the guests. Reluctantly, I walked over to the DJ booth, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the murmur of the crowd. The DJ, a young guy with sympathetic eyes, leaned in as I approached. Your mother-in-law insisted on non-Jene regret rain. Tough song, even for the pros. My stomach nodded. She had set me up to fail, to humiliate me in front of everyone we cared about. But I wasn't going to let her have this victory. Not today. I had something else in mind, something she wouldn't see coming. As I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, Mrs. Waverly clapped her hands, drawing the attention of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, please, let's give Sarah our full attention. She's been practicing so hard. Her voice was saccharine sweet, laced with venom. Remember, no laughing too loudly. The crowd turned to me, expectant faces all around. I could feel their curiosity, their anticipation. Some were puzzled, wondering since when had I developed a talent for singing, let alone in French. As the music started, I held the microphone with a shaky hand, knowing that I wasn't about to sing. Instead, I had orchestrated a reveal that would expose the true colors of the woman who had tried to undermine me at every turn. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the screen. I have something important to show you all, I announced, my voice echoing through the hall. The room hushed, the playful notes of the French song dying away as the projector flickered to life. Instead of the romantic vistas of France, the screen displayed a series of images and videos that captured Mrs. Waverly in intimate moments with the young pool cleaner. The gasps and murmurs swelled into a loud buzz as each new image made her deception clearer. Mrs. Waverly's face turned a deep shade of red, then white as she realized the extent of her exposure. She spun towards me, fury contorting her features. You wretch! How dare you invade my privacy like this? She shrieked, her composure breaking like thin ice underfoot. Tom was staring at the screen, his expression one of disbelief. When he finally spoke, his words were like daggers. You've destroyed my family's reputation with your spite. You're just an ungrateful beggar. You should have appreciated what we were offering you. My heart felt heavy, but my resolve did not waver. Tom, I replied, my voice clear and unwavering. You can't destroy what never existed. Your family's reputation was a lie. With that, I took off my wedding veil, placed the microphone back on its stand, and picked up my bouquet from the table. I walked up to Tom, and with everyone watching, I threw the bouquet at his feet. I could never marry a man who refuses to stand by me, who can't see the truth for what it is. The room was in chaos, whispers turning into shouts as the implications of the scandal began to sink in. Mr. Waverly turned to his wife, his voice laced with disgust. How could you do this to us? To our family? Meanwhile, Mrs. Waverly, now completely unhinged, tried to salvage her dignity, but it was too late. The damage was done. This is not the end, Sarah. I won't let it end like this, she hissed, her eyes darting around the room, looking for any ally in her downfall. But there were none. The guests were a mix of shocked and appalled, their faces reflecting a range of emotions from pity to disdain. The image of a united, respectable family had shattered, replaced by the reality of deceit and betrayal. As I walked out of the church, the weight of the dress felt lighter with each step, the cool air kissing my face with promises of new beginnings. Behind me, the sounds of a family unraveling filled the air, a poignant reminder of the bullet I had dodged. The aftermath was indeed tremendous. Mr. Waverly filed for divorce, and Mrs. Waverly found herself ostracized from the community she had once reigned over. Their family's business suffered as partners pulled out, unwilling to associate with scandal. Tom was left to deal with the fallout, his once unshakable belief in his family's integrity shattered. Years had passed since that fateful day at the altar, and I had since become a practicing surgeon, my days filled with long shifts and life-saving decisions. I had built a new life, one that was mine alone, shaped by my choices, not by deceit or manipulation. It was a typical day at the hospital when she came in, a patient, frail and barely recognizable, cloaked in tattered clothes, a stark contrast to the affluent attire I had once known her in. It took me a moment, but then the recognition hit. It was Mrs. Waverly, the mother of my ex-fiancé. She was wheeled into the emergency room, her face etched with lines of hardship and time, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pain and desperation. As the attending surgeon, it was my job to assess her condition. She needed surgery, urgently, but a quick check revealed she had no insurance, a fact that added yet another layer of complexity to the situation. "Dr. Sarah Thompson," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper as she recognized me. It was the first time she had addressed me without a sneer, and the irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. I need help. Tom, he's turned me away. I have nowhere else to go." "Mrs. Waverly," I started, keeping my voice professional, devoid of the emotions churning inside me. "You need surgery. But without insurance, it's complicated." She clasped her hands together, the once flashy rings she wore now absent, her fingers trembling. "Please, could you pay for it? Or at least do it for free? I'm begging you." Her plea was pathetic, a far cry from the commanding tone she once wielded like a weapon. I took a deep breath, the weight of her request heavy on my shoulders. This was more than just a medical decision, it was a moral crossroads. "Mrs. Waverly," I said slowly, each word deliberate. "I'm a surgeon, not a charity. You treated me horribly, manipulated your son against me, tried to ruin my life. You're not my responsibility. But I have nothing left," she countered weakly, the fight seemingly gone from her voice. "And whose fault is that?" I replied, my tone colder than I intended. "You made your choices, Mrs. Waverly. You chose to deceive, to scorn, to alienate. Now, you live with those choices." She looked at me, her eyes widening slightly as if seeing me for the first time. Not the young woman she could bully, but the doctor I had become, hardened by years of saving lives and surviving the cuts of both scalpel and scorn. "I will ensure you get the minimal care required by law," I continued, turning away to hide the conflict inside me. "But I won't pay for your surgery. I won't bend the rules for you. You need to make arrangements, or the state will." Leaving her in the care of the nursing staff, I walked out of the room, her soft sobs fading behind me. It was a harsh stance, perhaps, but life had taught me that mercy was a luxury sometimes, especially for those who had never shown any themselves.